Hey everyone! Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask a quick favour. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know, and makes a real difference in getting these stories out to more people. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much. And if you want, drop a comment letting us know what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy the content, please subscribe. It keeps us going. Now, tonight's story comes from a suggestion by Don Welsh, so thank you Don for this incredible idea. This is one of the most documented mass sightings in modern history, and the official explanation has never quite added up. Let's get into it. March 13th, 1997, 8:16 post-meridian Mountain Standard Time. Mike Fortson stood in his backyard in Ahwatukee foothills, the smell of grilling steaks mixing with the cool desert air. He was an air traffic controller at Sky Harbor International Airport, off duty for the evening, enjoying what should have been an ordinary Thursday night. His daughter Kylie, 10 years old, had been playing in the yard when her voice cut through the quiet. "Dad, what is that?" He looked up. What Mike Fortson saw in the next 4 minutes and 23 seconds would violate everything he knew about aviation physics, everything he had learned in 15 years of tracking aircraft across southwestern skies. A solid dark triangle moved across the sky above him. Not just large, massive. He estimated it at over a mile wide, perhaps larger. It moved at approximately 30 miles per hour, a speed so slow that any conventional aircraft that size should have fallen from the sky. The thing that unsettled him most was the silence. Complete, total silence. No engine roar, no jet wash, no sonic disruption, nothing. 7 amber lights arranged in perfect geometric formation marked its outline. As it passed overhead, Mike watched it block out stars, a moving void against the cosmos. He could see texture against the night sky, subtle variations in the darkness. Later, when pressed to describe it, he would say it was like looking at a battleship made of darkness, a vessel so enormous it seemed to bend reality around it. He checked his watch. 8:16. He watched. 8:18. 8:19. The craft continued its impossibly slow glide southward. 8:20. He couldn't look away. 8:21. His steaks were burning, he didn't care. At 8:21, he pulled out his cell phone and called his supervisor at Sky Harbor. "Mike, slow down, what are you seeing?" A craft, massive, maybe a mile wide, 7 lights, moving south over Ahwatukee at maybe 30 miles per hour. Silence on the other end. Then, "We have nothing on radar, Mike, nothing filed in any flight plan. It's right here, right above me. I believe you, but we have nothing. I'm going to make some calls. Mike, keep this quiet for now, okay?" That was the first indication that March 13th, 1997 would be remembered not just for what thousands of people saw, but for what the government insisted didn't exist. What became known as the Phoenix Lights involved 2 separate events that night. The 8 post-meridian sighting, the massive craft that Mike Fortson and hundreds of others witnessed, and the 10 post-meridian sighting stationary lights over Phoenix that would later be explained as military flares. 2 events, 2 completely different phenomena, but in the official narrative, only one would be acknowledged. By the time the night ended, over 700 witnesses would come forward. Police officers, pilots, military personnel, physicians, engineers. People whose careers depended on credibility, whose observations were trusted in matters of life and death. They all saw something, and they all knew that what they saw was being systematically ignored. This is the story of Operation Snowbird, the alleged code name for a black budget test that flew over one of America's largest cities. A test of technology we're not supposed to know exists. A test of public reaction, a test of plausible deniability. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Part 1. The witnesses. The first thing to understand about the Phoenix Lights is that these weren't confused civilians misidentifying Venus or swamp gas. These were trained observers, people who made their living identifying objects in the sky, assessing situations under pressure, documenting evidence with precision. And when someone with 13,000 flight hours tells you they saw something they can't explain, you listen. Lynn Kitay lived in Paradise Valley, one of the most exclusive areas of metropolitan Phoenix. She was a physician and health educator, formerly an actress with recognizable credibility. The night of March 13th was actually her 3rd sighting. On January 22nd, 1997, she had seen 3 amber orbs hover near her property. Strange, but not enough to break her scientific skepticism. On February 6th, she saw them again. This time she grabbed her camera. She managed to capture footage, shaky but clear enough to show 3 lights in triangular formation, stationary against the night sky. March 13th was different. She was standing on her balcony when she saw them coming from the north. Not 3 lights this time, 7. Arranged in a perfect V formation, moving south with deliberate, impossible slowness. She grabbed her camera again. This time the footage was steadier. The lights maintained their formation, amber and warm, definitely not the white-hot magnesium burn of flares. Lynn Katay had medical training. She understood observation bias. She understood the power of suggestion and mass hysteria. But this wasn't that. This was something solid, something real, something that thousands of others were seeing at exactly the same moment. She would spend the next 10 years investigating what she saw that night, eventually publishing a comprehensive documentary that would force even skeptics to acknowledge that something extraordinary had happened. Terry Ray was preparing for a flight. He was a captain for America West Lines with 13,000 flight hours, a man who had seen every type of aircraft, every atmospheric phenomenon, every trick of light and perspective that the sky could offer. He was on the tarmac at Sky Harbor International Airport when he saw it, the massive V-shaped craft moving overhead, silent and slow. He stood there, frozen, his pre-flight checklist forgotten. Other ground crew members stood with him, all of them watching. Later he would file a statement with the National UFO Reporting Center. His words were carefully chosen, the statement of a man who understood that his career could be affected by what he reported. "I've been flying for 23 years and I've never seen anything like this. Whatever it wasn't any aircraft I'm familiar with." Richard Thompson was a police officer in Paulden, a small town in northern Arizona. At 7:55 post-meridium, 40 minutes before Mike Fortson's sighting, he became the first official witness. He was on patrol when he saw lights approaching from the northwest. He pulled over, grabbed his binoculars and watched for over 2 minutes. Through the binoculars he could see individual orbs that appeared to be attached to something he couldn't see. Something large. Something blocking out stars as it passed. He filed an official report. It was logged, time-stamped, documented. A police officer on duty observing an unidentified craft in restricted airspace. The report was buried. Tim Lay and his wife Bobby, along with their grandson Hal, were in Henderson, Nevada, when they became the first civilian witnesses. Tim was a communications expert, someone who understood signal propagation, radar, and electromagnetic interference. At 7:55 they saw it approaching from the northwest. Tim grabbed his telescope. Through the eyepiece he watched a craft he estimated as bigger than a football field. 6 lights visible, but the sense that they were attached to something much larger. He watched it for several minutes as it continued south toward Arizona. He called the news stations, he called the police, he documented everything. Like Richard Thompson's police report, his calls were noted and forgotten. Mitch Stanley was an amateur astronomer in Scottsdale with a Dobsonian telescope, a serious piece of equipment capable of resolving significant detail. He was the only person who claimed to have seen structural details through magnification. Initially he reported seeing what appeared to be individual aircraft in formation, but later, after reviewing his notes and struggling with what he had actually seen, he became less certain. The objects moved wrong. They were too close together, the formation was too perfect. And above all, they were silent. Whatever Mitch Stanley saw through his telescope that night, it bothered him enough that he stopped giving interviews after a few months. Bradley Evans was an emergency room physician at John C. Lincoln Hospital. On break at 8:32 post-meridium, he was outside the emergency room entrance, smoking a cigarette and decompressing from a difficult shift. The craft passed directly overhead. He estimated the altitude at between 500 and 1,000 feet. That's low. That's commercial airliner on final approach low. He could see details, the way the light seemed embedded in something solid, the way it blocked out stars in a defined shape. He filed an incident report with the hospital security. The report documented the time, his observation, his professional assessment that this was an aircraft of unknown origin, operating at unsafe altitude over a populated area. The report was filed and never followed up on. The witnesses in Prescott, in Dewey, in Carefree all reported the same thing. A massive craft, V-shaped or triangular, moving south at consistent speed, absolutely silent. The timeline was clear. The craft had travelled from Henderson, Nevada to south of Phoenix, a distance of over 100 miles at approximately 30 miles per hour. Over 100 miles of continuous observation by hundreds of independent witnesses. And officially nothing was in the sky that night. Part 2. The immediate response. At Sky Harbor Air Traffic Control, the night shift was descending into chaos. Tower Supervisor James McGarr was fielding calls from pilots, ground crew and civilians. Every call described the same thing. Massive craft. V-shaped. Silent. Heading south. And on his radar screens, nothing. This wasn't a malfunction. Sky Harbor's radar was state-of-the-art, capable of tracking aircraft across hundreds of miles. It tracked commercial flights, private aircraft, even small Cessnas. But whatever was crossing the valley at that moment was invisible to radar. FAA protocols were being violated by the sheer volume of unexplained aerial phenomenon reports, but there was no procedure for this. What do you do when hundreds of people report seeing something that your instruments insist isn't there? At Luke Air Force Base, southwest of Phoenix, the official position was immediate and absolute. We had nothing in the air. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Jones, the base public affairs officer, issued a statement that would be repeated for years. No aircraft from Luke AFB were airborne during the sighting window. All training exercises had concluded earlier in the evening. The base had no explanation for what civilians were reporting, but there were discrepancies. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Fe-15 fighters scrambled around 8:45 post-meridiem, approximately 30 minutes after the initial sighting. The distinctive sound of military jets at full throttle, afterburners lighting up the sky. Witnesses in Scottsdale, in Tempe, in Mesa, all reported seeing the fighters climbing hard, heading toward the craft. The Air Force denied any scramble occurred. The Maryland Air National Guard's A-10 Warthogs were stationed at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson for winter training exercises. They would later admit to dropping flares at the Barry Goldwater Range at 10 post-meridiem, but that was 90 minutes after the initial sighting. The flares explained the second event, the stationary lights that hovered over Phoenix at 10. But the 8 post-meridiem sighting, the massive craft that hundreds witnessed, remained unexplained. Frances Barwood was a Phoenix City Council member, and she made a decision that would define her political career. She demanded an investigation. Witnesses contacted her office. Over 700 reports flooded in. Detailed accounts from credible people, pilots, police officers, engineers, all describing the same thing. She requested a formal inquiry. She contacted the FAA, the Air Force, the National Guard. She pushed for answers. Her colleagues ridiculed her. The media mocked her. She was painted as a conspiracy theorist, a publicity seeker, someone chasing little green men instead of focusing on real city business. But she persisted. In an interview with USA Today, she stated, "I've done more investigative work on this than the military, and I'm just a city councilwoman." That should tell you something about how seriously this is being taken. The ridicule reached its peak on March 19th, 6 days after the sighting. Governor Fife Symington called a press conference. Phoenix residents who had witnessed the craft, who had filed reports, who had demanded answers, tuned in hoping for acknowledgement, for validation, for investigation. Instead, they got theatre. Symington's chief of staff walked onto the stage dressed in an alien costume. The room erupted in laughter. Symington made jokes. The media ate it up. The witnesses, watching at home, felt the sting of public humiliation. But here's where the story takes a turn that wouldn't be revealed for another 10 years. In 2007, Fife Symington appeared on CNN for an interview about the Phoenix Lights. The former governor, no longer in office, no longer beholden to political pressures, made a confession that stunned the country. He had witnessed the craft himself. On the night of March 13th, he'd been in Phoenix. He'd seen it. He described it as otherworldly, something probably not of this world. The press conference, the alien costume, the mockery, it had all been damage control ordered by federal officials. In his own words, "I was in a position of public responsibility. Whatever the truth was at that time, I wasn't about to inflame the situation. The press conference was a bit of a sham. I wanted to avoid panic. A sitting governor had witnessed an unidentified craft over his state's capital, and instead of demanding answers, he participated in covering it up. The question became, who ordered that cover-up, and why?" Part 3, Operation Snowbird. The theory emerges. The Barry Goldwater Range sprawls across 1.7 million acres of restricted military airspace in southwestern Arizona. Established in 1941 and expanded throughout the Cold War, it has been home to classified aircraft testing since the 1950s. Luke Air Force Base uses it for live-fire training. The range is compartmentalized, meaning different sections are controlled by different commands, and what happens in one section may be completely unknown to personnel in another. It's the perfect location for testing technology that the public isn't supposed to know exists. The term Operation Snowbird allegedly appeared in leaked documents from a former contractor at Northrop Grumman's Pico Rivera facility. The documents were never verified. They were never produced. But the theory that emerged from those alleged leaks created a framework that actually explained what happened on March 13, 1997. According to the theory, Operation Snowbird was a psychological operation with multiple objectives. First, testing experimental propulsion system, specifically an alleged electromagnetic field propulsion system developed through black budget programs connected to Project Aurora, the rumoured successor to the SR-71 Blackbird. Second, gauging public reaction to massive aerial phenomena, measuring response times, media coverage patterns, civilian reporting behaviour, social media spread in the early internet era. Third, providing plausible deniability through the 10 post-meridian flare drop. The second event was allegedly staged specifically to give media something explainable to focus on, allowing the 8 post-meridian craft sighting to be memory holed. The players in this alleged operation read like a catalogue of classified aerospace development. General Ralph E. Eberhardt, who would later command NORAD and United States Space Command in 2000, was Vice Commander of Air Combat Command in 1997. His background included classified aerospace programs that have never been fully declassified. Paul Tiss was a former McDonnell Douglas aerospace engineer who worked on hypersonic projects. In the late 1990s, he gave presentations claiming that electromagnetic propulsion was decades ahead of public knowledge. He suggested that what the public thought was cutting edge was actually obsolete technology, that the real breakthroughs were hidden in black budget programs. Northrop Grumman had a history with unconventional aircraft. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, with its flying wing design, was revolutionary when it was revealed. But witness descriptions of the Phoenix craft matched a scaled-up flying wing configuration, something even larger, something utilising propulsion systems that Northrop had allegedly been developing since acquiring classified Nazi research at the end of World War II. Ben Rich, former director of Lockheed Skunk Works, died in 1995, 2 years before the Phoenix Lights. But before his death, he allegedly told a UCLA alumni group, "We now have the technology to take ET home." The quote is controversial. Some claim it was taken out of context, others say he never said it. But multiple attendees reported hearing it, and the implications were staggering. If Lockheed had technology that appeared extraterrestrial, what would prevent them from testing it over American cities to gauge public reaction? The smoking guns, according to conspiracy theorists, were everywhere if you knew where to look. The Radar Gap, Sky Harbor, Luke Air Force Base and Davis-Monthan all reported no radar returns. But coordinated radar blackout across multiple facilities suggests not the absence of aircraft, but the presence of something with radar-absorbent capabilities operating with full knowledge of military radar frequencies. The communications blackout. Multiple witnesses reported cell phone interference during the 8 post-meridian event, radio static, electronic disruptions, watches stopping, car electrical systems flickering. These are consistent with electromagnetic field effects, the signature of advanced propulsion systems operating on principles that interfere with conventional electronics. The F-15 intercepts. At least 12 witnesses reported seeing military jets pursuing or escorting the craft. The official record shows no scrambles, but pilots at Luke Air Force Base operate under classification protocols. If they were scrambled for a black budget test, they couldn't acknowledge it publicly. The flare discrepancy. Maryland Air National Guard Major Bill Graver confirmed dropping LUU 2B flares at 10 post-meridian during a training exercise. But witness descriptions of the 8 post-meridian event describe something entirely different. Amber and orange lights that didn't fall, didn't flicker, didn't burn with the characteristic magnesium intensity of military flares. They maintained perfect formation across over 100 miles of travel. 2 separate events, one explainable, one that defied conventional explanation. unless the explainable event was designed specifically to provide cover for the unexplainable one. Part 4. The alternative explanations that don't fit. The official story settled on a simple explanation. LUU-2, the aerial flares dropped by A-10 Warthogs during a training exercise called Snowbird 2. Snowbird was an actual operation name used for winter training exercises in Arizona, which added a layer of legitimacy to the explanation. But the problems with the flare explanation were immediate and insurmountable for anyone who actually examined the evidence. Timing. The flares were dropped at 10 post-meridium. The main sighting, the massive craft witnessed by hundreds, occurred at 8 post-meridium. That's a 2-hour gap. How do flares explain something that happened 2 hours before they were deployed? Behaviour. Military flares fall at approximately 1,000 feet per minute. They're designed to illuminate ground targets during night operations. They descend under small parachutes, drifting with wind, flickering and burning out within 3 to 5 minutes. The lights witnessed at 8 post-meridium maintained altitude and position for over 100 miles of travel. They moved in perfect formation. They didn't fall, they didn't flicker. They maintained consistent brightness for over 90 minutes of continuous observation. Witness descriptions. The people reporting the 8 post-meridium event included pilots and air traffic controllers intimately familiar with flares. Terry Ray had seen thousands of flares during his flying career. Mike Fortson had coordinated with Luke Air Force Base and witnessed flare drops from the tower at Sky Harbor. They insisted unequivocally that what they saw was not flares. Duration. Individual flares burned for 3 to 5 minutes. The craft was observed continuously from 7:55 post-meridium near Henderson, Nevada, until approximately 9:15 post-meridium south of Tucson. That's 80 minutes of continuous observation, with some witnesses watching for over 20 minutes at a time. No flare burns that long. No formation of flares maintains geometric precision for 80 minutes across 100 miles. Then there was the formation flying theory. Mitch Stanley, the astronomer with the Dobsonian telescope, initially reported seeing what might have been individual aircraft in formation. Skeptics latched onto this. Maybe it was a group of small planes flying in tight formation, they suggested. Maybe it was some kind of airshow practice. The problems with this theory were equally insurmountable. No flight plans were filed. The FAA requires flight plans for any formation flying, especially over populated areas. Nothing was filed for March 13th. No radar returns. Individual aircraft, even small ones, show up on radar. Multiple air traffic control facilities reported nothing. Sound. Aircraft aren't silent. At 500 to 1,000 feet altitude, the sound would be deafening. Even gliders make noise from air resistance. Hundreds of witnesses reported complete silence. FAA regulations. Formation flying at low altitude over populated areas is illegal. It's dangerous. It violates multiple federal regulations. If this was a group of pilots joyriding, they would have been prosecuted. Size. Witnesses didn't describe a group of small aircraft. They described something massive, something that blocked out stars across a span estimated at over a mile. Mike Fortson, an air traffic controller who spent his career estimating aircraft size and distance, insisted the craft was enormous, larger than any known aircraft. The hoax theory was perhaps the most insulting to the witnesses. 700 independent witnesses across 300 miles. Multiple video recordings from different locations showing consistent phenomena. Professional witnesses whose careers depended on credibility. Police officers who filed official reports. Pilots who contacted the National UFO Reporting Center. Physicians who documented observations. Engineers who analysed what they saw using professional training, and the government response. If it was nothing, why did Governor Symington call a press conference? Why did the Air Force issue statements? Why did Francis Barwood receive pressure to stop investigating? Hoaxes don't generate official government responses. Hoaxes don't create media firestorms. Hoaxes don't result in 10 years of investigation and documentary evidence. The mass hallucination theory was the final refuge of desperate debunkers. Lynn Kitay addressed this directly. I'm a physician. I understand the power of suggestion. I understand how perception can be influenced. This wasn't that. This was something in the sky that thousands of us saw with our own eyes. It was recorded on video. It was tracked across multiple cities. This wasn't hallucination. This was observation. Mass hallucinations require suggestion. They require environmental factors that create perceptual distortions. They don't create consistent observations across hundreds of miles. They don't result in multiple independent video recordings showing the same phenomena. They don't affect trained observers who are specifically educated to avoid observational bias. Every conventional explanation failed, which left unconventional explanations, and that's where things got interesting. Part 5. The cover-up evidence. The media manipulation began almost immediately. Within hours of the sighting, news coverage focused almost exclusively on the 10 post-meridiem lights. The stationary orbs that hovered over Phoenix, the ones that could be explained as flares. News broadcasts showed footage of those lights. Interviews centered on those lights. The narrative became mysterious lights over Phoenix, probably flares, case closed. The 8 post-meridiem sighting, the massive craft witnessed by hundreds, was barely mentioned. When it was discussed, it was lumped together with the 10 post-meridiem lights, creating deliberate confusion about timeline and characteristics. USA Today ran dismissive coverage. Local Phoenix stations played it for laughs. The national media, when they covered it at all, treated it as a quirky human interest story. Lights in the sky, probably swamp gas. Move along. The absence of serious investigative journalism was stunning. Over 700 witnesses, multiple videos, professional observers, official reports, and not a single major news organisation conducted a comprehensive investigation. Compare the media treatment of Phoenix lights to other mass witness events. When an airliner crashes, media descends for weeks. When a natural disaster occurs, coverage is exhaustive. But when hundreds of people witness unexplained aerial phenomena, when police officers file reports, when pilots contact UFO research centres, the media shrugs. Why? The witness intimidation claims add another layer to the alleged cover-up. John Kaiser was an amateur video analyst who enhanced some of the Phoenix lights footage. He applied professional-grade video analysis techniques and claimed he could see structural details in the enhanced footage. He reported being visited by individuals identifying themselves as Air Force personnel who requested his tapes and analysis. The Air Force denied any such contact. Multiple witnesses reported receiving phone calls warning them not to speak to media. The calls were vague, never explicitly threatening, but the message was clear. Keep quiet, move on, forget what you saw. Professional witnesses, pilots and military personnel refused to go on record. When contacted by researchers, they would acknowledge seeing something unusual, but wouldn't provide statements. Career concerns, they said. Didn't want to be associated with UFO sightings, couldn't risk professional reputation. The missing radar data is perhaps the most damning evidence of systematic suppression. FAA radar recordings from Sky Harbor for March 13th, 1997, were allegedly recorded over despite standard 15-day retention policy. When researchers requested the data, they were told it no longer existed. Routine recorded over, they said, but radar data showing nothing should have been preserved as proof that nothing was there. Instead, it disappeared. Luke Air Force Base radar logs were classified. Classified. Not missing, not recorded over. Classified. Which means they exist. They show something, and that something is being actively protected. NORAD tracking data was listed as unavailable. NORAD routinely monitors all airspace over the continental United States. They track everything from commercial aircraft to hobbyist drones. But for March 13th, 1997, over Phoenix, Arizona, the data is unavailable. 3 separate radar systems, 3 separate explanations for why the data can't be examined. Governor Symington's 2007 confession on CNN was the crack in the wall that skeptics couldn't explain away. A former governor, 10 years removed from office, with nothing to gain and his reputation to lose, admitted on national television that he had personally witnessed the craft. He described it as otherworldly, probably not of this world. He admitted that the press conference with the alien costume was a deliberate act of ridicule designed to diffuse the situation. Most damning, he stated that he was pressured to handle it that way, pressured by federal officials. He was told to avoid panic, to make it a joke, to let it blow over. In his own words, the press conference was a bit of a sham. I was in a position of public responsibility, and whatever the truth was at that time, I wasn't about to inflame the situation. Who pressured him? He wouldn't say. Federal officials, he said. That was as specific as he would get. But the implications were clear. Someone at the federal level wanted the Phoenix lights ridiculed and forgotten. They wanted a sitting governor to participate in covering up what he himself had witnessed. The absence of official investigation is the final piece of evidence. No FAA investigation despite a massive airspace violation. An unidentified craft over 100 miles long had allegedly flown through some of the most congested airspace in the southwestern United States, at altitudes as low as 500 feet, over populated areas, over airports, and the FAA conducted no investigation, no NTSB investigation despite potential aviation hazard. If this was misidentified aircraft, the NTSB should have investigated. If it was a hoax involving aircraft, the NTSB should have investigated. They didn't. No congressional hearing despite an elected official requesting one. Frances Barwood formally requested congressional inquiry. She presented evidence. She had witness testimony. She had documentation. Congress ignored her. No military inquiry made public despite intrusion over military installations. The craft allegedly flew over or near Luke Air Force Base, Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, and the Barry Goldwater Range. That's intrusion into restricted military airspace. That should trigger automatic investigation. If one occurred, it was never made public. In 1999, the French space agency CNES released the Cometa Report, a comprehensive study of UFO phenomena conducted by former military and intelligence officials. The report listed the Phoenix Lights as one of the most credible UFO events in modern history, citing the number of witnesses, the professional credentials of observers, and the lack of conventional explanation. European media covered the Cometa Report extensively. In France, in Germany, in the UK, the Phoenix Lights were discussed seriously as an event that demanded explanation. American media ignored it completely. Part 6. Operation Snowbird, the Faulty Theory. According to the conspiracy theory, the events of March 13, 1997 were not spontaneous. They were planned. They were executed with precision. They were part of a larger operation whose objectives went beyond simply testing an aircraft. The preparation phase began in January. Lynn Kitay's earlier sightings on January 22nd and February 6th weren't coincidence. They were test runs, smaller-scale events designed to gauge detection capabilities, to fine-tune whatever technology was being demonstrated, to prep local response infrastructure. The pattern was clear in hindsight. Small sightings, limited witnesses, brief duration, testing the system, working out the bugs, preparing for the main event. March 13th, 1997, the main event. According to the theory, the craft was deployed at approximately 7:30 post-meridian from an undisclosed location. Theories vary on where. Some suggest Edwards Air Force Base in California. Others point to Groom Lake, the facility commonly known as Area 51 in Nevada. The most intriguing theory suggests an underground facility at the Barry Goldwater Range itself, a hidden installation where classified aircraft are housed away from satellite observation. 7:55 post-meridian, first sighting in Henderson, Nevada. Tim Lay and his family observed the craft approaching from the northwest. It's travelling south-southeast at approximately 30 miles per hour, altitude varying between 1,000 and 5,000 feet. This was deliberate. This was a test of low-speed, low-altitude flight over populated areas. Conventional aircraft can't fly that slowly at that altitude. The physics don't work. But if the craft was using electromagnetic field propulsion, traditional aerodynamics wouldn't apply. 8:15 to 8:45 post-meridian, Phoenix Metropolitan Transit. The craft passes over the most populated areas of the valley. Altitude drops to as low as 500 feet, according to witnesses like Bradley Evans. This maximised the witness count. This ensured thousands of people would see it. Why? Because one of the objectives was testing public reaction in real time. How many people would report it? How quickly would they report it? What would they say? How would media respond? How would local government respond? How would military personnel not read into the program respond? The technology being tested, according to the theory, was electromagnetic field propulsion. The concept allegedly originated with Nazi research during World War II. The Schriever-Habermas experiments in Prague, testing disc-shaped aircraft using electromagnetic principles. When the war ended, American forces captured the research and the scientists through Operation Paperclip. The technology was further developed through black budget programs from the 1960s through the 1990s. The principle was revolutionary. Ionization of air creating a plasma field around the craft, reducing air resistance to near zero. This would explain the silence, no combustion engines needed. This would explain the smooth flight characteristics, no turbulence when air resistance is eliminated. This would explain the massive size capacity. When you're not fighting against gravity and air resistance, structural limitations change dramatically. The craft specifications, based on witness observations, suggested something beyond anything publicly acknowledged. Wingspan estimated at 1 to 2 miles, a flying wing configuration, V-shaped or triangular. 7 visible propulsion nodes corresponding to the 7 lights witnesses reported. Radar-absorbent materials, possibly metamaterials that bend electromagnetic radiation around the craft. Unknown crew, complement, possibly entirely AI-controlled given the smoothness of flight and perfect formation. At 8:45 post-meridian, according to the theory, F-15s were scrambled from Luke Air Force Base, not to intercept, to escort, to establish communications, to maintain a security perimeter. Witnesses reported seeing the jets. The Air Force denied any scramble, but if this was a black-budget operation, pilots couldn't acknowledge their participation. The craft allegedly altered course slightly after the fighter intercept, began ascending, and was last credibly observed around the Tucson area around 9 post-meridian. At 9:30, the craft returned to base. Where? Unknown. Underground facility is the prevailing theory. Alternative theory suggests it climbed to extreme altitude and departed the region entirely, heading back to wherever it came from. Then came the cover operation. 10 post-meridian. Maryland Air National Guard drops LUU-2B flares over the Barry Goldwater Range. This was deliberate. This was planned. This created an explainable event that media could focus on. Witnesses would be confused. Testimony would be muddied. The 8 post-meridian sighting would be forgotten in favour of the 10 post-meridian lights that could be dismissed as flares. The objectives of Operation Snowbird, according to the theory, were multi-layered. Technology validation, proof of concept for next-generation aircraft or spacecraft. Could this propulsion system work? Could it operate at low altitude over populated areas? Could it maintain stability and control? Psychological profiling. How do civilians react to something this extraordinary? How does media respond? How does local government respond? How do military personnel who weren't briefed respond? All of this data would be valuable for future operations or eventual disclosure. Operational security testing. Can such a craft be operated over populated areas without confirmation of its existence? Can plausible deniability be maintained? Can witness testimony be dismissed or explained away? Desensitization. Preparing public consciousness for eventual disclosure of advanced technology. Get people used to seeing things in the sky that don't fit conventional understanding. When the technology is eventually revealed, the shock will be lessened. International signalling. Demonstrating capabilities to foreign intelligence agencies monitoring United States airspace. Russia, China, other nations with satellite surveillance, sending a message. We have technology you can't match. Why Phoenix specifically? Proximity to Barry Goldwater Range meant controlled airspace for recovery. Large population provided extensive witness sampling for psychological data. Clear skies ensured perfect visibility and optimal observation conditions. Multiple military installations provided support operations and security perimeters. Distance from major media centres on the coasts made narrative control easier. Phoenix was the perfect testing ground. Part 7. The Aftermath and Legacy. In the immediate aftermath, over 700 witness reports were filed with Francis Barwood's office. Peter Davenport's National UFO Reporting Centre received over 200 calls. The Phoenix MUFON chapter was formed to investigate. Lynn Keaty began her decade-long investigation that would culminate in a comprehensive documentary. But the ridicule campaign was already underway. Governor Symington's alien costume press conference on March 19th set the tone. Media mockery followed. Witnesses were painted as confused, hysterical, attention-seeking. The psychological impact was severe. Professionals became afraid to report similar sightings. Pilots stopped filing reports. Police officers kept quiet. The message was clear. If you talk about this, you'll be ridiculed. But slowly the truth began to emerge. In 2000, the documentary The Phoenix Lights was released, compiling witness testimony and video evidence. In 2005, witnesses gave testimony at the National Press Club in Washington, demanding investigation. In 2007, Governor Symington's confession on CNN forced mainstream media to acknowledge the event. In 2008, Lynn Keaty's documentary gained traction, reaching audiences who had never heard the full story, and then the similar incidents began to be reported. February 6, 2007, the 10th anniversary of Lynn Keaty's first sighting. Lights appeared over Phoenix again. The official explanation was flares, but witness descriptions were eerily similar to the 1997 event. Stephenville, Texas, in 2008. Multiple witnesses, including a police officer, reported a massive craft. Similar descriptions, similar official denial. O'Hare Airport in 2006. United Airlines employees reported a disc-shaped craft hovering over the airport. The FAA dismissed it as weather phenomena despite multiple witnesses and radar anomalies. The pattern suggested ongoing operations. Whatever was tested over Phoenix in 1997, it hadn't been a one-time event. The questions that remain are profound. If this was terrestrial technology, why the secrecy 27 years later? Stealth aircraft are eventually revealed. The B-2 bomber was classified for years but eventually acknowledged. Why not this? If this was testing, why overpopulated areas instead of restricted ranges where observation could be controlled? Why has no whistleblower with direct knowledge come forward? Black budget programs leak. People talk. Documents surface. But Operation Snowbird, if it exists, has remained completely compartmentalized. Where is this technology now? If electromagnetic field propulsion was functional in 1997, what capabilities exist in 2024? The cultural impact of the Phoenix Lights has been significant. It became the most documented mass UFO sighting in history. It shifted the conversation from fringe believers to credible witnesses. It forced serious discussion of government transparency and black budget oversight. It raised fundamental questions about what our own government develops in secret, and whether that secrecy serves national security or simply avoids accountability. Closing! It's 2024 now. Mike Fortson is retired. He still lives in Ahwatukee, in the same house with the same backyard where he stood on March 13th, 1997. On clear nights he sometimes stands in that same spot. The grill is newer. His daughter Kylie is grown now, has children of her own. But the memory is fresh. 4 minutes and 23 seconds that changed everything he thought he knew. He's given up trying to convince people, the ridicule, the eye rolls, the mass hysteria explanations. He's heard them all. But he knows what he saw, so do 699 others. In his home office he keeps a folder, inside his original incident report, never filed, never acknowledged. His notes from that night, written at 8:45 post-meridium while the images were still fresh. A printout of the FAA radar log that shows nothing, an absence of data that itself tells a story. He thinks about the term someone used once, Operation Snowbird. A winter training exercise, they said. Just flares. But Mike Fortson knows flares. He's watched thousands of them during his career, coordinating with Luke Air Force Base. Flares fall, flares flicker, flares don't maintain formation at 30 miles per hour for over 100 miles. Flares don't block out stars in a defined geometric shape. Flares don't make experienced air traffic controllers question everything they know about aviation. On March 13th, 1997, something flew over Phoenix. Something massive. Something silent. Something that thousands of people saw but the government insists didn't exist. Maybe it was a test of technology we're not supposed to know about yet. Black budget programs developing propulsion systems that make our public aerospace capabilities look primitive. Maybe it was Operation Snowbird, a name for a program that might not even exist, covering for capabilities we can't imagine. A test not just of technology, but of our willingness to accept official explanations that don't match observed reality. Or maybe, and this is what keeps Mike Fortson awake some nights, maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe Operation Snowbird wasn't a test of our technology. Maybe it was a test of us. The lights over Phoenix have never been officially explained. 27 years later, the files remain classified. The radar data remains missing. The truth, whatever it is, remains locked away. And somewhere, in a facility whose name we'll never know, whose location isn't on any map, whose budget isn't in any congressional record, the answer sits in a file marked Operation Snowbird. Before we begin tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content here on Sleep Theories, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know, and it allows us to keep bringing you these deep dives into the unexplained. Also, if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. What if the child who came home wasn't entirely the same child who disappeared? There's a photograph that haunts the internet. You've probably seen it. A small boy, dirty and exhausted, wrapped in a blanket, staring into a camera with eyes that seem far too old for his face. The rescue photo from June 2022, taken moments after 3-year-old Riker Webb was found alive in the Montana wilderness after vanishing for 2 terrifying nights. The world celebrated a miracle. Parents everywhere felt relief wash over them. Search and rescue teams were praised as heroes. The story had a happy ending. But if you look closer at that photograph, if you read between the lines of the official reports, if you listen to the whispers from Lincoln County, Montana, you'll find something else entirely. Something that suggests the miracle wasn't as simple as a lucky find. Something that implies those 2 days in the woods changed more than just a frightened child's perspective. This is the story of what really happened to Riker Webb, or at least what might have happened. Because the truth, as you'll soon discover, has been carefully managed, quietly buried, and deliberately obscured. My name is Elena Ferguson, and I'm a journalist from Spokane, Washington. I spent a year investigating this case, and what I found will make you question everything you thought you knew about missing children, wilderness survival, and the things that live in places humans rarely venture. Intro: the photo that never made sense. June 5, 2022, Montana. When Riker Webb walked out of those woods, when search teams found him inside an abandoned shed nearly 2 miles from his home, the relief was universal. News outlets ran the story with headlines like "Miracle in Montana" and "Toddler beats the odds." His parents wept with joy. The community of Troy, a tiny outpost in Lincoln County with barely 1,000 residents, exhaled collectively. But I remember seeing that photograph for the first time and feeling something other than relief. Call it journalistic instinct or maybe just human intuition. But something was wrong with the picture. Not technically wrong. The image was clear enough. The rescue workers looked appropriately concerned. The blanket wrapped around the boy was standard issue emergency gear. It was his face that bothered me. His hair looked different. Matted, yes, from 2 nights in the rain, and cold. But there was something about the way it framed his features that seemed older somehow, as if he had aged more than 48 hours. His expression didn't match what you would expect from a 3-year-old who just endured a terrifying ordeal alone in bear country. There was no crying, no reaching for parents, no visible fear or relief. Just this calm, almost watchful stare. And his eyes. God, his eyes looked wrong. Not injured or diseased, but wrong in a way I couldn't articulate then and still struggle to explain now. They looked like they'd seen something no child should see. Something no adult should see, for that matter. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Online forums began picking apart the photograph within hours. Reddit threads spawned conspiracy theories. Facebook groups dedicated to missing persons cases flagged the image as unusual. Most of it was the typical internet noise, people seeing patterns where none existed, making mountains from molehills. But some of the observations were harder to dismiss. Someone pointed out that Riker's skin tone seemed different in the rescue photo compared to family pictures taken weeks earlier. Another noted that the way he held his hands seemed too controlled for a traumatized toddler. A retired pediatric nurse commented that his facial expressions suggested a developmental age inconsistent with 3 years old. The mainstream media ignored these observations, as they should have. Conspiracy theories about missing children are dangerous territory, and most of the speculation was baseless. Most of it, but not all of it. Because as I dug deeper, as I travelled to Troy and started interviewing people who were actually there, who actually participated in the search, who actually saw Riker in those first hours after he was found, I realised the official story had holes. Big holes. The kind of holes that exist because the truth has been carefully excavated and replaced with something more palatable. This is that truth, or as close as I could get to it. Act 1. The real timeline. Let me start with what we know for certain. The documented facts that nobody disputes. June 3, 2022. Late afternoon, around 4 o'clock, Riker Webb disappeared from his family's yard on Deerwood Lane in Troy, Montana. He'd been playing outside while his parents worked on household projects. The yard backed up to dense wilderness, the kind of thick forest that characterises northwestern Montana, all Douglas fir and western larch, with underbrush so dense you can't see 10 feet in any direction. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. His parents called the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office immediately. By evening, a full-scale search operation was underway. Ground teams, ATVs, tracking dogs, air support with helicopters, everything you'd mobilise for a missing child in mountain country. The conditions were brutal. Temperatures that night dropped into the low 40s. Heavy rain moved through the area. This was wilderness where mountain lions prowled and black bears were common. The terrain was unforgiving, full of cliffs and ravines and abandoned mining cabins from Montana's resource extraction past. The search continued through June 4th and into June 5th. 72 hours of coordinated effort involving dozens of volunteers, professional search and rescue teams, and law enforcement from multiple agencies. Then, on the morning of June 5, almost exactly 48 hours after he vanished, Riker was found inside a shed on Pine Ridge Road, approximately 2 miles from his home. According to the official report, he was dirty, hungry, quiet, and alert. He showed signs of exposure but no serious injuries. He was taken to a hospital for evaluation, checked out as remarkably healthy given the circumstances, and returned to his grateful parents. Case closed. Miracle achieved. Happy ending secured. Except for the details that didn't make the news, the observations that were logged and then buried, the witness statements that were taken and then classified, the evidence that suggested Riker's survival wasn't miraculous. It was impossible. Let me walk you through what I found. Act 2. The First Lies. The shed owner was a man named Reginald Dixon, a retired logger in his 70s, who lived about a quarter mile from the structure where Riker was discovered. I interviewed him at his home, a modest cabin that smelled like wood smoke and old coffee. Reginald was cooperative but clearly uncomfortable. He told me the shed had been locked the last time he checked it, over a week before Riker disappeared. He hadn't stored food there, no blankets, no supplies that might help a child survive. Just tools, he said, staring at his hands. Old equipment I don't use much anymore. The door had a padlock on it. I'm certain of that. But when the search team found Riker, I pressed, the door was open. Wide open, he confirmed. Lock was gone. Never found it. Could Riker have opened it himself? Reginald looked at me like I'd suggested the child could fly. He's 3 years old, miss. That lock required a key. Even if it didn't, even if it was somehow left unlocked, the door swelled from rain. I had to put my shoulder into it last time I opened it. A grown man's shoulder. So someone else opened it. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that stuck with me. Something opened it. That's all I know for certain. The distinction felt important. I pushed further, asking about Riker's condition when he was found. Reginald hadn't been present for the discovery, but he'd spoken to the search team members who were. They said he looked cold but not hypothermic, Reginald recalled. Which doesn't make sense, does it? 2 nights in the 40s with rain? A child that small should have been in serious trouble, but his core temperature was apparently fine, like something kept him warm. The shed itself. That shed has gaps in the walls you could stick your finger through. It's not insulated. It barely keeps the rain out. I thanked Reginald for his time and moved on to my next source, but his words echoed in my mind. Something opened it. Something kept him warm. Not someone. Something. My next breakthrough came through a Freedom of Information Act request I'd filed months earlier. The search and rescue logs finally arrived, heavily redacted but still revealing. Most of it was standard documentation. Team assignments, search grid coordinates, timing of various sweeps through the forest. But scattered throughout were observations that painted a very different picture than the official narrative. June 4, 11:23 a.m. Thermal anomaly detected on ridge approximately 1.3 miles northeast of last known position. Negative on visual confirmation. Signature disappeared before ground team arrival. June 4, 2:47 p.m. Multiple thermal signatures appear and disappear rapidly in Sector 7. Equipment malfunction suspected but unconfirmed. Signatures do not match known wildlife patterns. June 4, 7:15 p.m. Team 3 reports audible childlike vocalization from unreachable location. Cliff face prevents access. Vocalization ceased before climbing equipment deployed. And then the entry that made my hand shake when I read it. June 4, 9:03 p.m. Eyes in the tree line. Size inconsistent with known wildlife. Recommend daylight follow-up. Location marked. This entry was written by a volunteer firefighter named Marcus Tully. I tracked him down to a bar in Libby, about 30 miles south of Troy. He refused to talk to me at first, literally walked away when I introduced myself and mentioned Riker's case. It took 3 visits, and finally buying him dinner before he'd even acknowledge being on the search team. "I don't talk about that night," he said, pushing food around his plate. "I was told not to talk about that night." Told by who? He looked up at me, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. People who made it clear my cooperation was appreciated and my silence was expected. "What did you see, Marcus?" He was quiet for a long time, then so softly I almost missed it. Something watching us. Something big enough that the eyes were level with mine and I'm 6 feet tall. But it was crouched in the brush, I could tell by the angle. If it stood up. He didn't finish the sentence, he didn't need to. "Did you tell the search coordinators?" "I logged it. You've seen the log, so you know I logged it. They told me it was probably a bear standing on its hind legs. But I've seen bears, miss. I've seen them up close. That wasn't a bear." "What was it?" "I don't know," he said, meeting my eyes. "And I don't want to know. I've got a family. I've got a life here. Some questions aren't worth asking." I had one more question for him, though. "The helicopter footage," I said. "The FLIR imaging from the air search. Have you seen it?" His expression darkened. "It doesn't exist. Officially. But unofficially? Unofficially, the pilot saw something he wasn't supposed to see. Unofficially, that footage was classified faster than you can blink. Officially, there was a malfunction, and no usable imagery was captured." I managed to track down the pilot, a man named Sam Keller, who worked for a private helicopter service contracted by the county. He was even more reluctant to talk than Marcus, but I caught him at the right moment after a few drinks at a hangar party when his guard was down. "I saw something moving behind that kid," he told me, words slightly slurred. In the thermal image, clear as day, something big crouched down like it was, I don't know, hiding, protecting him. The shape was wrong for a person, too tall, too thin. But it was there, right behind where we found him the next morning. What happened to the footage? 2 guys in suits showed up at my office 6 hours after the search ended. Didn't identify themselves, just said the footage was part of an ongoing investigation, and they were confiscating the storage drives. I never saw them again, never got the drives back. When I asked the county about it, they told me there was no record of any confiscation. As far as they're concerned, the footage never existed. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes. But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't nothing. Act 3. Local legends. Local fear. The Kootenai tribe has lived in this region for thousands of years. Long before Montana was Montana, long before white settlers arrived with their maps and mining claims. Their reservation isn't far from Troy, and I'd heard rumours that some of the tribal elders had knowledge about the forest that went beyond simple folklore. It took time to build trust, to find someone willing to talk to an outsider about sensitive subjects. But eventually, through a contact at the Tribal Cultural Centre, I was introduced to an elder named Joseph Running Bear. We met at his home, a modest house surrounded by pines, where he served me tea and studied me with eyes that seemed to see more than I was comfortable with. "You're asking about the Webb boy," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Mr. Running Bear. I'm trying to understand what happened to him." He nodded slowly. "The forest near Troy has been different. For as long as our people have memory, we have stories about that place. Old stories." "What kind of stories?" "Stories about the mimics, the lost ones, the things that live in the deep woods and sometimes take interest in humans, especially children." He poured more tea, taking his time, choosing his words carefully. "Our legends speak of beings that can imitate human voices, especially the voices of children. They call out in the dark, leading people astray. But sometimes, rarely, they do the opposite. Sometimes they protect." "Protect who?" "The innocent, the vulnerable, children who wander into their territory." I felt a chill run through me despite the warm tea. "Why would they do that?" Joseph shrugged. "The stories don't explain their motivations. Maybe they're lonely. Maybe they remember being human once if they ever were. Maybe they operate on logic we can't understand. But the pattern is consistent. Some who go missing in those woods return, and some who return are not quite the same." "Not the same how?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "They come back changed. Sometimes physically, sometimes in behaviour, sometimes in ways harder to define. Like they've seen something, experienced something, that fundamentally altered them. The eyes are usually what people notice first. The eyes look older." My hands were shaking. I set down the teacup. "Has this happened before? With other children?" "I cannot speak to specific cases," he said carefully. "But I can tell you that the area around Bull Lake Road and Pine Ridge Road has a history. Our people avoided certain parts of that forest traditionally. We marked them as places where the boundary between worlds is thin." After leaving Joseph's home, I went to the Lincoln County Courthouse and started digging through old records, missing persons cases going back decades. What I found was disturbing in its consistency. 7 missing child cases since 1960, all within a 2-mile radius of Pine Ridge Road. 3 found alive, all with memory gaps, all describing similar experiences. Darkness, cold, then warmth, a presence that felt protective rather than threatening, and finally being led or carried to a place where humans could find them. The other 4 were never found. The 3 survivors all exhibited behavioural changes after their return. Withdrawal, night terrors, unusual maturity for their age. In each case, the official explanation was trauma from being lost in the wilderness. But reading between the lines, reviewing old police reports and newspaper articles, I could see the pattern Joseph had described. Something in that forest takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they come back different. I managed to track down a woman who taught at Riker's preschool, though she insisted on anonymity. We met at a coffee shop in Kalispell, far enough from Troy that she felt safe talking. "He changed after he came back," she told me, stirring her coffee nervously. "I mean, you'd expect some trauma response, right? A child going through something that frightening. But it was more than that." "How so?" "He was more withdrawn, yes. The night terrors were bad, according to his parents, but there was also this maturity. Like he'd suddenly understood things he shouldn't understand at 3 years old. The way he'd look at you sometimes, it was like being evaluated by an adult in a child's body." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "He kept talking about the other boy. Said the other boy was nice, that the other boy kept him warm, that the other boy told him stories." "Did his parents mention this?" "They told me he was just processing the trauma through imagination, creating an imaginary friend to cope with being alone, but But what? One day, about a month after he came back, he was drawing in class. I looked over his shoulder and saw he'd drawn 2 figures. When I asked him who they were, he said, "Me and him." I asked who him was, and he looked at me like I was stupid. He said, "The other boy." He said he'd stay in the woods so I could come home. He said it was a fair trade. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. I mentioned it in a report to the school counsellor. 2 days later, I was called into the principal's office with a county official I'd never met. They told me that spreading rumours about the Webb case was harmful to the family and potentially actionable. They strongly suggested I focus on Riker's present well-being and stop dwelling on his statements about the experience. They threatened you. They didn't have to threaten explicitly. The message was clear. Stop talking about this, or there will be consequences. Act 4. The eyewitness who breaks the case. For months, I'd been trying to find someone from the original search team willing to go on record with details that contradicted the official story. Most refused outright. Others simply stopped returning my calls. The culture of silence around the Webb case was ironclad. Then I got a call from a number I didn't recognise. The voice on the other end was elderly, male, hesitant. "Miss Ferguson, my name is Benjamin Hartley. I understand you've been investigating what happened to the Webb boy. I think we should talk." We met at his home outside Troy, a small ranch house with a view of the Cabinet Mountains. Benjamin was in his late 60s, a retired contractor who'd volunteered with search and rescue teams for over 30 years. "I was there," he said simply, once we'd settled in his living room. "I was on the team that found him." My heart rate picked up. "Can you tell me what you saw?" He pulled out a folder, old and worn, and handed it to me. "These are copies I made before I turned in my official report. I knew even then that something wasn't right about how the whole thing was being handled. Inside were photographs, notes, sketches, evidence that had never made it into the public record. "We found footprints," Benjamin said, pointing to one of the photos, next to where Riker had been. Small footprints consistent with a child his size, but there were others. The photograph showed depressions in the mud near the shed. Alongside the small prints were larger ones, much larger, and they were barefoot. "Human?" I asked. "Shaped like human feet," Benjamin corrected, but the proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, and the stride length suggested something tall. Very tall. How tall? Based on them spacing, I'd estimate 7 feet, maybe more. He showed me another photograph, this one showing drag marks in the dirt. These led to the shed, short marks like something was being carried. The spacing and depth suggested significant weight, more than a 3-year-old child, like whatever was carrying him was heavy enough to sink deeper into the ground. Could it have been an animal? A bear? Benjamin shook his head. "I've tracked animals my whole life. These weren't animal prints. And there were these other impressions." He pointed to circular marks in another photograph. "We couldn't figure out what made these. They were too regular to be natural, too random to be man-made. One of the guys on my team said they looked like a deer standing on its hind legs might make, but that's absurd." "What did the sheriff's office say?" "They told us to exclude the unusual prints from our official report. Said it would confuse the investigation and distract from the main goal of finding Riker safe. When I pointed out that Riker had already been found, they changed their reasoning. Said it would traumatise the family to know something else had been near their son. Said we should focus on the positive outcome and not create unnecessary fear." He leaned back, looking tired. "But here's the thing that really bothered me. When we actually found Riker, when we approached the shed, the door was standing wide open. Not just unlocked, open, like something had just left. Did you see anything?" "No, but I felt it. We all felt it. Something watching us from the tree line. Something that disappeared the moment we got close to the boy." Benjamin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. "I recorded part of the search team briefing that morning. I wasn't supposed to, but I had a feeling things were about to get strange. I was right." He played the recording for me. The audio quality was poor, but I could make out voices discussing the search plan. Then clearly a deputy's voice. We are classifying the unidentified presence as environmental. Do not report visual details in your statements. Keep your descriptions limited to the child's condition and location. Another voice, one I didn't recognise. Higher authorities have already been contacted. They'll handle the anomalous elements. Your job is to stick to the facts. The simple facts. I looked at Benjamin. Higher authorities? No one ever identified who they were, but 2 unmarked vehicles showed up that afternoon. Federal plates. The men inside asked to review all our documentation. They were particularly interested in the photographs of the footprints and the thermal imaging data. What do they look like? Professional, clean-cut, the kind of people who are used to having authority and not explaining it. One of them, the one in the green jacket, interviewed several of us separately. He asked strange questions. Like what? He wanted to know if Riker had spoken to it. His exact word, it. Not who, not what, just it. He asked if the boy seemed older somehow, if he looked like himself. At the time, I thought the questions were bizarre. Now, he trailed off, looking out the window at the mountains. Now I think he knew exactly what we'd found, and he was checking to see if Riker had been changed by whatever was out there with him. Act 5. The conspiracy deepens. The more I investigated, the more layers I uncovered. What had started as a simple question about a missing child had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Through various sources, I'd learned that several agencies had been present during and immediately after Riker's rescue. The obvious ones were expected. Local search and rescue, Lincoln County Sheriff's deputies, Montana Fish, wildlife, and parks officers. But there were others. 2 unmarked federal vehicles had arrived the afternoon of June 5. No one could tell me which agency they represented. The men inside carried no visible identification, but had authority that local law enforcement immediately deferred to. One witness, a volunteer who'd been helping coordinate the search from a command post, told me the man in the green jacket had arrived with very specific questions that suggested prior knowledge. He knew there would be unusual elements before anyone told him, the witness said. He arrived asking about them, not whether they existed, but what they were specifically, like he'd been briefed in advance. The questions this man asked were telling. Did the boy speak to it? Did he seem older when you found him? Did he look like himself? Were there any physical changes you noticed? That last question bothered me most. Physical changes. As if such things were expected, anticipated even. Through a contact in the medical community who insisted on absolute anonymity, I learned something that chilled me to the bone. Riker's medical evaluation at the hospital showed anomalies. His cortisol levels were elevated far beyond what trauma alone would explain, suggesting exposure to extreme prolonged stress. But more significantly, the blood work showed cellular activity that the attending physician flagged as unusual. Unusual how? I'd asked. Like accelerated cellular turnover. Like his body had aged more than 2 days at a cellular level. The doctor wanted to run additional tests, but before she could, someone from administration came down and seized all the samples and paperwork. They said there had been a filing error and the tests needed to be redone at a different facility. Were they redone? Not as far as I know. The whole incident was classified as a clerical mistake and expunged from the record. But the doctor who initially examined him? She left the hospital 3 months later, moved out of state. When I asked her about it at her going-away party, she just said some questions weren't worth the answers. There was another detail that kept nagging at me, something so seemingly impossible I almost discarded it entirely. But journalism is about following the evidence, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. When search teams initially interviewed Riker about how he survived, his answers were inconsistent with the official narrative. According to multiple sources who were present but refused to go on record, Riker repeatedly mentioned the quiet boy. He said the quiet boy kept him warm. The quiet boy told him not to be scared. The quiet boy brought him to the shed where people could find him. The quiet boy said it was okay to go home now. Search teams scoured the area for any sign of another child. They found nothing. No footprints that matched a second child. No evidence anyone else had been in the shed. No missing persons reports for children in the region. The quiet boy didn't exist, except Riker insisted he did, and the details he provided were too consistent, too specific to be simple imagination. He described the quiet boy as tall like Daddy, and cold to touch, and didn't talk with his mouth. When pressed on what that last part meant, Riker apparently said the quiet boy talked in the quiet place, touching his own head. Telepathy. The child was describing telepathy. This detail was quickly dismissed as imagination by officials, but it was logged. Someone wrote it down. Someone thought it was significant enough to document before the sanitization of the official record. Ast 6. Return to Pine Ridge Road. A year after Riker disappeared, I returned to Pine Ridge Road with camera equipment and a thermal imaging device borrowed from a friend in wildlife research. I wanted to see the site for myself, to walk the ground where something impossible had occurred. The shed was still there, more weathered now, door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. I approached carefully, documenting everything with my camera. The interior was exactly as Benjamin had described. Empty, dilapidated, gaps in the walls large enough to see through. No insulation, no supplies. Nothing that would help a small child survive 2 nights of cold and rain. I was about to leave when I noticed something in the dirt floor near the back wall. Fresh tracks, recent tracks. I knelt down, examining them carefully. A footprint. Larger than a child's, smaller than an adult's. Barefoot. The proportions were wrong, elongated, just like in Benjamin's photographs. My hands were shaking as I took pictures. This print couldn't be more than a few days old, maybe a week at most. The edges were too clean, the definition too sharp. Something had been here recently. I expanded my search, circling the shed, looking for more evidence. Under a rock about 20 feet from the structure, I found something that made my blood freeze. A drawing. A child's drawing, done in crayon on what looked like paper from a fast food restaurant placemat. The crayon and paper were faded but still recognisable. The drawing showed 2 figures. One was small, clearly meant to be a child, labelled me in shaky letters. The other was taller, much taller, with elongated limbs and large dark eyes. It was labelled him. The proportions of the tall figure were disturbing. The arms reached past the knees. The fingers were too long. The eyes were solid black, taking up too much of the face. This was Riker's drawing. It had to be. The style matched what a 3-year-old could produce. But how did it get here? Had his parents brought him back to the site? Had he left it here himself during some return visit? Or had something else placed it here, preserved under a rock, waiting to be found? I pocketed the drawing and continued my investigation as the sun began to set. I'd planned to leave before dark, but something compelled me to stay. Call it journalistic dedication or morbid curiosity. I wanted to experience the site the way Riker had experienced it. At night, alone, vulnerable. I set up my thermal camera on a tripod, pointing it at the tree line, and settled in for a long night. Act 7. The thing that watches. Around midnight, the forest changed. I can't explain exactly how. The ambient noise didn't stop, the temperature didn't drop dramatically, there was no obvious shift in the environment. But something changed. The quality of the darkness felt different, heavier, more attentive. Then I heard it. A child laughing. High and clear and completely out of place in the deep woods after midnight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but saw nothing. The laughter continued, moving through the trees with impossible speed, first to my left, then to my right, then behind me. My rational mind screamed that it was an animal, a fox or a bird, something with a call that mimicked human sounds. But my instinct knew better. This was laughter. Human laughter. A child's laughter. Then it spoke. "Hello?" A child's voice. Riker's voice. I recognised it from news footage I'd watched dozens of times, but Riker was miles away, safe at home with his parents. "Hello? Are you lost?" The voice was getting closer. I fumbled with my thermal camera, pulling up the display screen with trembling hands. 2 heat signatures appeared in the image. One was child-sized, standing about 30 yards into the tree line. The other was larger, much larger, crouched behind the first. The proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the torso too narrow, the head too large. I watched, frozen, as the smaller signature moved toward me. The larger one stayed back, unmoving, just watching. "Are you lost?" the child's voice asked again, now close enough that it should have been visible even in the darkness. But I saw nothing with my eyes. Only the thermal camera showed the approaching heat signature. When it was about 15 feet away, it stopped. The larger signature behind it shifted, rising slightly as if preparing to move. Then both vanished. Not gradually, not walking away, just gone, as if they'd been switched off. I sat there in the darkness for another hour, shaking, watching the thermal display for any sign of their return. Nothing. The forest was empty. At dawn, I packed up my equipment and examined the area where the signatures had been. The ground was soft from recent rain. There should have been footprints if something physical had been there. There were. Small barefoot prints, child-sized, and larger ones behind them, the same elongated proportions as the print I'd found in the shed. They led deeper into the forest, toward the ridge where search teams had reported thermal anomalies during Riker's disappearance. I followed them for about 100 yards before they simply ended at the base of a large cedar tree. Not faded, not obscured, just ended, as if whatever made them had ceased to exist at that exact spot. Conclusion. What came back? I spent another 2 months investigating, interviewing more witnesses, filing more records requests, trying to build a coherent picture of what happened in those woods. The truth, as best as I can determine it, is this. Riker Webb wandered into the forest on June 3, 2022. Something found him there. Something old. Something that lives in the places humans rarely go. Something that operates on logic we don't understand. This something kept him alive. Protected him from the cold, the rain, the predators. Led him to a structure where humans would eventually find him. And then, when rescuers arrived, it disappeared back into the wilderness. But protection came with a price. Riker returned physically unharmed but fundamentally changed. His eyes looked older because he'd seen something humans aren't meant to see. His behaviour changed because he'd experienced something children shouldn't experience. His memory gaps exist because some knowledge is too dangerous to retain consciously. The government knew about this. Maybe not specifically, maybe not in advance, but they had protocols in place. They arrived quickly, they seized evidence, they suppressed unusual details, they intimidated witnesses into silence. Which suggests this has happened before. The pattern of missing children in that area going back decades, the tribal legends about the mimics and the lost ones, the federal response that was too coordinated to be improvised. Something lives in those woods near Troy, Montana. Something that occasionally takes an interest in lost children. Sometimes it returns them, but they always come back different. The official story says Riker Webb survived alone through luck and the resilience of children. The official story is a lie. A necessary lie, perhaps, because the truth would raise too many questions, create too much panic, fundamentally challenge our understanding of what shares this world with us. But the truth remains, hidden in redacted documents and suppressed testimonies, and the haunted eyes of a child who spent 2 nights in the presence of something impossible. Riker Webb didn't survive alone. Something helped him. Something the forest keeps hidden. Something that watches, even now, from the tree line. Something that returns children. But not always the same. I returned to the site one final time before leaving Montana. I stood at the edge of the forest, looking into the shadows between the trees, and I felt it watching me. Not threatening, not hostile, just observing, deciding perhaps if I was worth engaging with. I left the drawing I'd found under the same rock where I'd discovered it. I don't know why. It felt like the right thing to do, like returning something to its rightful owner. As I drove away, I glanced in my rearview mirror. At the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, too still to be human. It raised one elongated hand in what might have been a wave. Then it stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I haven't been back to Troy since. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the boundary between possible and impossible feels thin, I think about Riker Webb. I wonder what he remembers from those 2 days. I wonder what he was told by the quiet boy who kept him warm. I wonder what fair trade was made in that dark forest. And I wonder if, someday, something will come to collect. This has been the story of the 2 days Riker can't remember. Or perhaps, the 2 days he's not allowed to remember. The truth remains out there, in the woods near Troy, in the places humans rarely venture, in the shadows between the trees. Some mysteries are solved, some are buried, and some, like this one, simply wait in the darkness, patient and timeless, for the next lost child to wander into territory that was never really ours to begin with. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And if you ever find yourself lost in the deep woods and something offers to help you find your way home, remember Riker's story before you accept, because protection always comes with a price. And sometimes the cost isn't paid until long after you think you've made it home safely. Good night. Before we descend into the sealed corridors beneath the Vatican, I want to give a shout out to Spot Boogie for suggesting this topic. If you're enjoying this investigation into what might be hidden beneath one of the most secretive institutions on Earth, please drop those hype points on this video. Seriously, it helps the channel way more than you possibly know, and it lets me know which stories resonate with you all the most. Also, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now, and where in the world are you listening from? Only if you want to share, of course, but we absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's incredible to think we've got people from every corner of the globe all diving into these mysteries together. Alright, let's get into it. April 10th, 2023, Rome. The Vatican Library smelled the way Lucian Ferraro always imagined eternity might smell. Ancient parchment, furniture polish, and centuries of whispered prayers absorbed into stone walls. After 6 years of begging for access, 2 years of proving his credibility, and 18 months of actual work in these halls, he'd learned to appreciate the weight of history that pressed down on every researcher who entered this place. Lucian had wanted this since childhood, since the day his grandmother, a devout Catholic who attended Mass every morning, told him that the church held secrets that would make the angels weep. She'd said it casually while making pasta in her tiny kitchen in Naples, but the words had burrowed into his young mind and never left. Now 38 years old, divorced, estranged from his daughter who lived in Milan with her mother, Lucian had poured everything into his work. Historical research was all he had left. The Vatican archives represented the pinnacle of his field, the ultimate validation that his life's choices had meant something. He'd been cataloguing routine acquisition records for 3 hours when he found it. Tucked between 2 requisition forms from 1957 was an envelope that shouldn't have existed. No barcode, no classification number, just a single phrase stamped in faded red ink across yellowed paper. Archivum Subterraneum, Level 4. Lucian's hands trembled as he broke the brittle wax seal. The sound echoed in the quiet reading room, a soft crack that seemed too loud. He glanced around, suddenly paranoid, but the only other person visible was an elderly priest dozing 3 tables away. Inside was a single torn page. The edges burned as if someone had tried to destroy it but couldn't finish the job. The paper was brittle, fragile as a dried leaf. The letterhead bore the papal seal of Pope Pius XII, the 3-tiered crown above crossed keys, embossed in gold that had faded to a dull bronze. The date read June 19th, 1948. The text was brief, written in Latin with a shaky hand, as if the writer had been under tremendous stress. But 3 phrases leapt out at him, each one more impossible than the last. Objectum originis celestis, ex deserto recuperatum, an object of celestial origin, recovered from the desert. Crypta obsignata sub fundamento Sancti Petri, the sealed vault beneath St. Peter's foundation. Non licet homini comprehendere, not permitted for man to comprehend. Lucian read it twice, then 3 times, his heart hammering against his ribs. His academic mind catalogued the implications while his hands shook with something between excitement and dread. An object of celestial origin. In 1948, just after Roswell. Hidden beneath the Vatican itself. This was either the discovery of his career or an elaborate forgery. Either way, he needed documentation. He reached for his phone to photograph the document, his fingers fumbling with the lock screen. The reading room door burst open with a bang that made the dozing priest jerk awake. 2 Swiss guards in plain clothes, dark suits, no ceremonial halberds, crossed the marble floor with purposeful strides that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. Behind them, a thin man in clerical black with silver-rimmed glasses approached Lucian's desk with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. "Mr. Ferraro," the man said quietly, his English accented but precise, each word chosen with care. "You found something that requires immediate return to the restricted archives." Lucian's mouth went dry. How did they know so quickly? Had the reading room been under surveillance, or had someone known the document was there, waiting for whoever found it? "I was just cataloguing the 1957 acquisitions," Lucian said, trying to keep his voice steady. "This was misfiled." "We're aware." The cleric extended his hand, palm up, patient as stone. "The document, please. I should file a report. Document where it was found, proper archival procedure." "The document," the man repeated, his tone unchanged but somehow harder. "Now, Mr. Ferraro." Lucian hesitated, looking down at the yellowed page in his hands. The Latin text seemed to burn into his vision. He could feel the weight of history in that single sheet, secrets that had been hidden for 75 years. He surrendered the page. The cleric placed it in a leather folder without looking at it, closing the cover with a soft snap that sounded final, as a tomb ceiling. "Your research privileges are suspended pending review," the man said, producing a laminated card from his pocket. Lucian's access badge. How did he already have it? "Please gather your belongings and exit the premises." "On whose authority?" Lucian asked, anger finally breaking through his shock. "The Holy Seas." The cleric's eyes were flat, unreadable behind his silver-rimmed glasses. "Immediately, please." One of the guards stepped closer, a subtle reminder that this wasn't a negotiation. As they escorted him through the marble corridors toward the exit, Lucian's mind raced. He hadn't photographed the document, but he didn't need to. Years of historical training had taught him to memorize quickly, to absorb details that others missed. He replayed the phrases in his head over and over. Objectum originis caelestis. crypta obsignata, non licet homini comprehendere. They walked past reading rooms where other researchers worked in blissful ignorance, past glass cases displaying illuminated manuscripts worth millions, past frescoed walls depicting saints and angels and the glory of divine creation, all of it built on a foundation that might contain proof of something else entirely. The guards deposited him on Via della Conciliazione without ceremony, without explanation, without even a word. The morning sun felt too bright after the library's shadows, the noise of traffic and tourists jarring after the hushed reverence inside. Lucian stood on the sidewalk, tourists streaming past him towards St. Peter's Square. Families taking photos, pilgrims saying prayers, everyone seeking connection with the divine, and made a decision. Whatever they were hiding, whatever that document referenced, he would find it. He had memorized enough to begin his search, and something told him that his expulsion wasn't just about a misfiled document. They'd been too quick, too efficient, as if they'd been waiting for someone to find it, as if this was a test. Act 1. The real history of the Vatican Archives. The Vatican Secret Archives, officially renamed the Vatican Apostolic Archives in 2019, in an effort at transparency that fooled no one. Occupy a building tucked behind the Cortile del Belvedere, accessed through a nondescript door that most tourists walk past without noticing. To most of the world, they represent an impenetrable fortress of historical documentation spanning 12 centuries. Lucian knew better. The archives weren't just a library. They were a maze built on secrets, organised by an organisational system so Byzantine that researchers often joked it was designed to prevent discovery rather than enable it. Back in his cramped apartment in Trastevere, a fourth-floor walk-up with a view of laundry lines and satellite dishes, he spread his research across the kitchen table that doubled as his desk. The apartment was small, furnished with second-hand pieces and stacks of books that served as impromptu furniture. The walls were covered with maps of Rome, architectural diagrams, timelines he'd created for various research projects over the years. Now he created a new timeline, 1948, the year everything changed. Years of studying Vatican history had prepared him for this moment, though he'd never imagined he'd use that knowledge to investigate something so deeply buried. His doctoral dissertation had focused on Vatican diplomatic correspondence during World War II, dry academic work that had earned him respect in his field, but little excitement. Now, looking at his notes with fresh eyes, he saw patterns he'd missed before. The facts were straightforward enough, public knowledge available to any researcher willing to dig through the bureaucracy. The archives were officially founded in 1612 under Pope Paul V, consolidating documents that had been scattered throughout various papal residences for centuries. The collection grew through conquest, donation, and sometimes theft. Cardinal Scipione Borghese alone had acquired tens of thousands of documents from noble families across Italy. Today, they contained more than 50 miles of shelving, holding an estimated 35,000 volumes of catalogued materials. 53 miles of documents. That number always stuck with Lucian. 53 miles of human history, of papal bulls and diplomatic letters, of Inquisition records and banking ledgers, of everything the Catholic Church had done or witnessed for more than 1,000 years. But that was only what they acknowledged publicly. The research process itself was Kafkaesque. Researchers could access portions of the collection, but only through a Byzantine application process that required letters of reference, academic credentials, and a stated research purpose. You couldn't browse. You couldn't wander the stacks picking up interesting volumes. You had to request specific documents by name and catalogue number, which meant you had to already know what you were looking for, and many sections required special permission that was rarely, if ever, granted. Then there were the sealed sections, the archives within the archives. Lucian pulled up a file on his laptop containing notes from his dissertation research, typed late at night in the library at Bologna where he'd completed his studies. The Vatican had always maintained certain documents under restriction. Some were sealed for 75 years to protect living individuals mentioned in sensitive correspondence. Others were sealed indefinitely for security of the church and protection of the faithful, a phrase so vague it could mean anything. But in 2020, Pope Francis had done something unprecedented. He'd opened the previously sealed archives of Pope Pius XII, covering his entire papacy from 1939 to 1958. The move was meant to address historical questions about the Church's response to the Holocaust, to show transparency, to demonstrate that the Vatican had nothing to hide. Except they did. What caught Lucian's attention were the documents that remained sealed even after that historic opening. Not many researchers noticed. Most were too busy combing through the newly available material about World War II. But Lucian had noticed because he'd tried to request certain specific files related to 1948 and been told they were administratively restricted pending further review. Administrative restriction, a bureaucratic phrase that meant someone with authority had decided these particular documents were too sensitive even for the general opening. Why? He found his answer in a footnote of an academic paper from 2021, published in an obscure Italian historical journal. A researcher named Elena Martelli had mentioned in passing that certain subsections of the Pius XII archives remained administratively restricted pending further review, with no timeline provided for future access. When Lucian had contacted her 2 years ago for his own research into Vatican-allied communications, she told him something odd over a crackling phone line from her office in Florence. They'd spoken late at night. She kept unusual hours, she'd explained, because the quiet helped her think. There's a section they don't even list in the finding aids, she'd said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper even though she was alone in her office. Old Vatican hands, the archivists who've been there for decades, they call it the basement of Index 2. I made the mistake of asking about it once. The next day, my access permissions were reviewed for procedural compliance. I was told to stop asking about it if I wanted to keep my research privileges. What's in it? Lucian had asked. I don't know, but whatever it is, they're serious about keeping it hidden. Not just sealed, denied, as if it doesn't exist. Now that memory took on new significance. The basement of Index 2, Level 4. Were they the same thing? Lucian opened a browser and started searching for anything connected to Level 4 and Vatican architecture. The search led him down a rabbit hole of building permits, construction records, and blueprints filed with Roman city authorities over the past century. What he found made him sit back in his chair and stare at the screen. The Vatican wasn't just built up, reaching toward heaven with its dome and spires. It was built down, deep into the earth, into chambers that predated Christianity itself. The foundations of St. Peter's Basilica rested on ancient Roman structures, which in turn had been built over older temples and burial grounds. But there were modern excavations too, recent ones, secret ones. Act 2. The strange events of 1948. Understanding what happened in 1948 required understanding the man at the centre of it all. Pope Pius XII, Eugenio Pacelli, one of the most controversial and enigmatic popes in modern history. Born in Rome in 1876 to a family of Vatican lawyers, what they called the black nobility, the aristocracy who served the papal court, Pacelli had been groomed for Vatican service from childhood. He'd served as papal nuncio to Germany, watched the rise of fascism firsthand, and became Vatican Secretary of State before his election to the papacy in 1939, just 6 months before Hitler invaded Poland. His entire reign was defined by World War II and its aftermath. The moral compromises, the diplomatic silence, the complicated dance between condemning evil and protecting the Church's institutional survival. Historians still debated whether he'd done enough to oppose the Holocaust, whether his silence had been strategic or cowardly, whether he'd saved thousands through quiet diplomacy, or betrayed millions through inaction. But Lucian wasn't interested in the well-documented controversies. He was interested in the gaps, the moments when the historical record went silent. He pulled up a timeline of papal activities from 1947 to 1949, compiled from the Vatican's own published records, newspaper accounts, and diplomatic cables, public appearances, encyclicals, audiences with ambassadors, meetings with cardinals, all meticulously recorded in the kind of detail that only the Vatican bureaucracy could maintain. Most popes lived lives of rigid routine, their days scheduled in 50-minute increments, every moment accounted for. Pius XII was famous for his discipline, rising at 6 for private mass, working through mountains of paperwork, meeting dignitaries, praying the rosary while walking in the Vatican gardens. But June of 1948 showed something unusual. A 3-week gap where the Pope's daily schedule simply noted private retreat and prayer at Castel Gandolfo. 3 weeks, 21 days. For a Pope whose schedule was normally planned months in advance, who maintained diplomatic contact with dozens of nations, who oversaw a church with hundreds of millions of faithful worldwide. Lucian cross-referenced this with other sources. The Italian newspapers from that period, he'd accessed digital archives from La Stampa and Corriere della Sera, made brief mentions of the Pope's retreat but nothing unusual. A few articles speculated about his health. At 72, Pius was showing his age after the stress of the war years, but then Lucian found something in the Vatican personnel records, available through various historical databases that tracked clerical assignments. During that same June period, unusual activity spiked among Vatican astronomers and members of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Travel vouchers, equipment requisitions, overtime authorizations for technical staff, all clustering around the dates of the Pope's retreat. The Vatican had been running astronomical observatories since the late 1800s, when Pope Leo XIII established the Specula Vaticana to demonstrate that the Church wasn't opposed to science, that faith and reason could coexist. By the 1940s, it was staffed primarily by Jesuit scientists, men who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, but who also held doctorates in astrophysics and mathematics. 2 names appeared repeatedly in the 1948 correspondence that Lucian could access: Monsignor Georges Lemaitre and Father Daniel O'Connell. Lemaitre was famous, the Belgian priest who'd first proposed what would become the Big Bang Theory back in 1927, to the consternation of scientists who thought a Catholic priest couldn't possibly understand cosmology. Einstein himself had initially rejected Lemaitre's mathematics, only to later admit the priest was right. By 1948, Lemaitre was one of the most respected cosmologists in the world, advising the Pope on scientific matters. Father O'Connell was less well known publicly, but highly influential within Vatican circles. He would later become the director of the Vatican Observatory from 1952 onward, but in 1948 he was a senior researcher specialising in spectroscopy, the analysis of light from distant stars to determine their composition. Lucian found a digitised letter dated July 7, 1948, in a collection of declassified diplomatic correspondence. It was from O'Connell to Giovanni Battista Montini, then the substitute Secretary of State, essentially the Pope's Chief of Staff. Montini would later become Pope Paul VI, but in 48 he was the man who made the Vatican bureaucracy run. The letter was brief and formal, the kind of official memo that filled filing cabinets. Your Excellency, regarding the object brought to our attention on June 23rd, preliminary spectroscopic analysis confirms structural composition inconsistent with known terrestrial metallurgy. Father Lemaitre concurs with initial assessment. Material exhibits properties not found in standard periodic table elements. Recommend highest level of discretion and continued study under restricted access. Respectfully submitted, Father Daniel O'Connell, S.J. The object. Lucian read the letter 3 times, his coffee growing cold beside him. The language was careful, diplomatic, designed to reveal nothing to casual readers. But between the lines was something extraordinary. June 23rd. That was right in the middle of the Pope's 3-week retreat. An object with properties not found in standard periodic table elements, requiring highest discretion. He dug deeper into 1947 and 48, expanding his search beyond the Vatican. Those years buzzed with strange reports, if you knew where to look. The Roswell incident in July of 1947, the alleged UFO crash in New Mexico, that the military initially confirmed, then retracted, claiming it was just a weather balloon. Multiple UFO sightings across Europe and North America, the beginning of what researchers called the modern UFO era. Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting of flying saucers over Mount Rainier in June 47, the Maury Island incident, the Mantell crash, strange lights over Sweden and Norway that military officials couldn't explain. The world was seeing things in the sky that didn't fit conventional understanding, and apparently the Vatican was finding things on the ground. Lucian found another thread: archaeological expeditions. In February 1948, a French-Egyptian archaeological team had been excavating near St. Catherine's Monastery at the base of Mount Sinai in Egypt. The monastery itself dated back to the 6th century, built on the site where Moses was said to have encountered the burning bush. It was one of the oldest continuously operating Christian monasteries in the world. The expedition, led by the Louvre Museum in partnership with the Egyptian Department of Antiquities, had been exploring Roman-era structures in the vicinity. A brief article in Le Monde from March 5, 1948, mentioned that the team had discovered previously unknown chambers beneath ancient foundations, and had found artifacts of unusual origin requiring further study. Then nothing. The expedition was abruptly shut down in late March. No final report was ever published. The artifacts were never catalogued or displayed. Lucian tracked down everything he could find about the expedition leader, François Dubois. An accomplished archaeologist, Dubois had worked on major digs across the Middle East before and after the war, but he never published anything about the Sinai excavation. In fact, he barely worked again after 1948. He found a 1983 obituary from a regional French newspaper. Dubois had spent his final years in a village in Provence, refusing interviews, declining to discuss his career. But a former colleague, quoted in the obituary, mentioned something haunting. François changed after Sinai. He used to love talking about his work, his discoveries. After that expedition, he wouldn't discuss it. The one time I pressed him, years later over wine, he said something I've never forgotten. What we found wasn't meant to be found. The church understood that better than we did. Some knowledge is a curse, not a gift. He never explained what he meant. The church understood that better than we did. Lucian stood and paced his small apartment, his mind racing. The pieces were connecting across decades and continents. An archaeological team finds something strange in Egypt. The expedition is shut down. Shortly after, the Vatican receives an object that its best scientists can't explain. The Pope goes into seclusion for 3 weeks. And 75 years later, documents referencing all of it are still sealed. What had they found beneath Mount Sinai? And why was it now sitting in a vault beneath the Vatican? Act 3. The first clues of the underground. Giuseppe Momo had been dead since 1940, but his work lived on in one of the Vatican's most photographed features, the double helix staircase designed in 1932 to connect the Vatican museums to the street level. What most tourists didn't know was that Momo had designed far more than just a staircase. Lucian spent 2 days in Rome's municipal archives, requesting every building permit and blueprint filed for Vatican construction between 1930 and 1950. The Vatican was technically a sovereign city-state, but construction that involved Roman utilities or infrastructure required coordination with Italian authorities. What he found was extraordinary. In 1935, Momo had submitted plans for expanded archive storage facilities beneath the Vatican Library. The blueprints showed 4 subterranean levels extending more than 60 feet below ground. The drawings were technical and detailed. Level 1 was clearly the main archive floor, high ceilings, climate control, standard library storage. Level 2 showed denser shelving, lower ceilings, presumably for less accessed materials. But Level 3's blueprint was different. It showed a series of sealed vault rooms, each with reinforced walls marked as pressurized containment. Notation in Italian indicated specialized environmental controls and restricted access protocols. And then there was Level 4. The blueprint for the lowest level was sparse, just a single large chamber marked Sala Indicis, nullus accessus. The hall of the index, no entry. No details about what the chamber contained. No specifications for shelving or storage. Just a rectangular space with walls marked in red ink and a single access point from level 3. Lucian photographed every page. He needed to talk to someone who'd actually been inside. Finding a former Swiss guard willing to talk wasn't easy. The Vatican's ceremonial security force took their vows of discretion seriously, even after retirement. But Lucian had made contacts during his years researching church history. Matteo Ricci had served from 1981 to 1991, long enough to see administrations change and secrets accumulate. Now in his mid-60s, he lived in a modest house in Frascati, in the hills outside Rome. They met at a cafe overlooking the town square. Ricci was compact and fit despite his age, his eyes still carrying the watchful quality of someone trained to notice everything. He listened as Lucian explained his research in careful, general terms. "You're asking about the lower archives," Ricci said finally. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "What you need to understand is that the guard's duties include protection of materials, not just people. We rotate through different posts. Some are ceremonial, some are very much not." "Level 4?" Lucian asked. Ricci sipped his espresso. "In 10 years of service, I escorted exactly 3 people to level 4. All of them were astronomers from the observatory. All 3 visits happened during night shifts. Each time they went down alone after we opened the seals. We waited at the level 3 checkpoint. What did they do down there? I don't know. They never spoke about it. But I can tell you this. They all looked different when they came back up. Not frightened, exactly. Shaken. Like they'd seen something that changed how they understood the world. Did you ever see what was down there? No, but I heard something once." Ricci leaned forward. "During one of those night escorts, while we were waiting on level 3, I heard a sound from below. Mechanical, like a generator running, but with a different pitch. Almost like humming. It came through the ventilation system. Humming? Not continuous, intermittent, and it didn't sound like any machinery I'd heard before." He paused. "One of the other guards joked that it sounded like something breathing. He was reassigned the next week." Lucian felt his skin prickle. "When was the last time someone accessed level 4? "While I was serving. 1989. A Jesuit astronomer from Castel Gandolfo. After that night, the access protocols changed. Papal authorization required in writing. Do you know what they keep down there?" Ricci looked at him for a long moment. "Officially? No. But Vatican security operates on need to know. What I needed to know was, protect access to level 4, trust no one without proper authorization, and never ask questions." He finished his espresso. "But in 10 years you hear things. Other guards, older staff, whispers in the mess hall. There's something down there that predates most of the collection upstairs. Something they've been keeping sealed since before I was born." "What do the whispers say it is?" "Proof," Ricci said quietly. "Proof of something the Church has been protecting the world from knowing. Act 4. The object that changed everything. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source, a deathbed confession." Lucian found it in an online archive of oral histories collected by a retired American journalist named Robert Hayes. Hayes had spent the 1990s interviewing former intelligence operatives, diplomats, and clergy about Cold War secrets. One interview, conducted in 1997, with a former Vatican archivist named Monsignor Carlo Benedetti, had been labelled sensitive and embargoed until 2025. But someone had leaked it early. The audio quality was poor, but Benedetti's voice was clear enough. "They brought it in through the service entrance at night," the old priest said. "This was July of 48, just after the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. I was a young clerk then, working in the manuscript department. We all knew something unusual was happening because Cardinal Montini himself was there, and he never came down to the archive floors." "What did they bring?" Hayes asked. "A container. Metal. Very heavy. Required 4 men to carry it. About the size of a steamer trunk. It had markings on it I didn't recognise. Symbols that weren't Latin, weren't Greek, weren't anything I'd studied." "Where did it come from?" "Egypt, we were told. recovered from an expedition near Sinai, but there were rumours it had been found in a chamber that predated the monastery, predated Christianity entirely. Some said the chamber had been sealed since before the Exodus. What was inside the container? A long pause on the recording. I never saw it opened, but I helped catalogue the documentation that came with it. There were photographs, black and white, not very clear. They showed an object that looked like a sphere, maybe 30 centimetres across. The surface appeared metallic, but with a strange texture, almost organic. The photographs showed it under different types of light, and in some of them you could see symbols or writing covering its surface. Writing in what language? Unknown! The philologists couldn't identify it. One of them said it didn't match any known alphabet, ancient or modern. Another said the mathematical properties of the symbol arrangement suggested it wasn't human. The recording hissed with static. The documentation included field notes from the excavation, Benedetti continued. They'd used what was then cutting-edge technology, Geiger counters. The object was emitting radiation, but not any type they could identify. Not alpha, beta, or gamma, something else. What did the Vatican do with it? His Holiness issued a decree personally. The object was designated Custodia Angelica, the angelic custody. Everything related to it was classified at the highest level. The container was taken to a vault I'd never heard of below the regular archives. The documentation was locked away separately. Did you see the decree? Only a copy, briefly, before it too was sealed. But I remember one line very clearly. It said, "Documents and items that challenge the created order are to be sealed at the highest level, known only to the throne of Peter and those he deems necessary for the Church's protection." Challenge the created order, Hayes repeated. What does that mean? I think it means, Benedetti said slowly, that whatever they found, it contradicted the fundamental understanding of how the world was made, of humanity's place in creation, of where we came from. Are you saying it was extraterrestrial? Another long pause. I'm saying the Church believed it was important enough to hide from the world for eternity. The interview ended shortly after. Lucian sat in his apartment, the audio file playing in the background. Custodia Angelica, the angelic custody. He pulled up everything he could find about Pope Pius XII's activities in July 1948. The public record showed normal audiences, a meeting with diplomats from newly formed Israel, routine business. But Lucian found something else, a photograph from the Vatican newspaper, dated July 28, 1948. It showed Pius XII in the Vatican gardens, but the caption noted he was recovering from a brief illness that had kept him from public audiences the previous week. The Pope wasn't sick often. Medical records eventually made public showed he'd been in good health throughout that period. So why the absence? Lucian thought about the logistics. If you're the Pope, and someone brings you an object that challenges the created order, what do? You don't just lock it away. You try to understand it. You consult experts, astronomers, scientists, theologians, and you pray. Maybe a week of illness was actually a week of grappling with the implications of what had been found beneath the desert. Lucian needed to know more about the object itself. If Vatican astronomers had examined it, there might be records at the observatory. He started making plans to visit Castel Gandolfo. Act 5. What lies below Level 4. The Vatican Observatory occupied part of the Papal Palace at Castel Gandolfo, the Pope's summer residence in the Alban Hills. In 2014, Pope Francis had opened the palace to visitors, but the observatory itself remained an active research institution. Lucian arranged a visit under the pretense of researching the history of Vatican astronomical work. He was granted a brief tour and time with one of the senior Jesuits, Father Antonio Marchetti, who oversaw the historical archives. Marchetti was in his 70s, his cassock immaculate, his manner warm but cautious. They spoke in the library, surrounded by century-old telescopes and stellar charts. "We're proud of our history," Marchetti said. "The Church has always sought to understand God's creation through reason and observation." "I'm particularly interested in the post-war period," Lucian said. 1947 through 50. There seems to have been significant activity. Ah, yes. Lemaitre was doing revolutionary work then, and Father O'Connell was leading important observations. Were they examining anything unusual during that time, beyond standard celestial observations? Marchetti's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Define unusual. Lucian decided to take a risk. I found references to an object brought to the Vatican in 48, something that required analysis by trained astronomers. The old priest was quiet for a moment, studying Lucian's face. "You're talking about the Sinai artifact," he said finally. Lucian's heart raced. "Yes." Marchetti stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gardens. "I shouldn't discuss this, but I'm old, and perhaps the truth deserves to see daylight eventually." He turned back. "What do you know already?" "That an object was recovered from Egypt, that it showed unusual properties, that Vatican astronomers examined it, and that the findings were sealed." "We shared data with NASA in the 70s, Marchetti said quietly. "A gesture of scientific cooperation. Some of it came from the 48 analysis." "What kind of data?" "Radiation signatures unlike anything in our reference materials. Structural analysis showing molecular arrangements that don't match known periodic table configurations. And something else." He paused. "Inside the sphere, we found a partial star map." "A map?" "Etched into the interior surface, visible only under specific wavelengths of light. It showed stellar positions, but the configuration didn't match any known region of space visible from Earth. Either it was created from a different vantage point in the galaxy, or it's very, very old and the stars have shifted." "How old?" "The metallurgical analysis suggested the object was at least 10,000 years old. Possibly much older. The radiation decay rates indicated it had been sealed in that Egyptian chamber for at least 3,000 years. Lucian absorbed this. What did the Vatican conclude? Officially? Nothing. The research was classified and the object was sealed away. But unofficially, Marchetti returned to his chair, we concluded that Earth had been visited by an intelligence not of this world, sometime in deep antiquity, and that they'd left evidence of their presence. Why seal that away? Why not share it? Because of what else we found, Marchetti said. When we decoded portions of the symbols on the sphere's surface, using pattern analysis and comparative linguistic methods, we discovered something disturbing. What? The symbols seemed to reference genetic information, specifically structures that closely resembled the human genome, which we didn't even fully understand until decades later. It was as if the object contained a blueprint, or a recipe. The implications crashed over Lucian like a wave. "You're saying it showed that humans were—" "I'm saying the artifact suggested that human development may have been influenced, possibly engineered, by whoever created that sphere. And if that's true, it contradicts fundamental church teaching about divine creation. So they buried it." "They protected the faith," Marchetti corrected. "Imagine announcing to the world in 1948 that humans might be the product of ancient extraterrestrial intervention. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, during the beginning of the Cold War, when people were desperate for meaning and stability, the world would have come apart. Do you think it's still there? In the vault?" Marchetti looked at him carefully. "I think some truths are meant to remain sealed until humanity is ready for them, and I think we're still not ready." But Lucian was already planning his next move. AC-6. The modern cover-up. Getting back into the Vatican archives without authorization would be impossible through conventional means. But Lucian had spent years studying the administrative structure of the Holy See, and he knew one thing. Bureaucracies, even ancient ones, ran on routine. He started by mapping the patterns. The archives closed to researchers at 6 in the evening. Regular staff departed by 7. Security made rounds every 90 minutes through the night, but there were blind spots, service corridors, maintenance access, the kinds of back channels that existed in any old building. Lucian befriended a maintenance supervisor at a cafe near the Vatican, bought him enough drinks to loosen his tongue, and learned about the utility tunnels connecting various Vatican buildings. Some dated back to medieval times, others were added during Renaissance construction, still others carved out in the 20th century for modern infrastructure. He obtained contractor coveralls and a forged work order, waited until the lunch shift change, and simply walked through a service entrance marked authorised personnel only. Inside, the Vatican was a maze of marble and shadows. Lucian followed the blueprints he'd memorised, descending through maintenance stairwells that weren't shown on any tourist map. The air grew cooler, the stone older. He reached a bronze door beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, exactly where Momo's blueprints indicated level 1 of the underground archives began. Etched into the metal were words in Latin: "Non licet hominis intrare." Man may not enter. The door wasn't locked. Why would it be, this far from normal access? Lucian pushed it open and stepped into history. The corridor beyond was stone, lit by LED strips that seemed obscenely modern against the ancient walls. The temperature was precisely controlled, the air dry and still. He could hear the hum of climate control systems. Level 1 was as the blueprint showed, vast shelving units holding bound volumes, bankers' boxes, archival containers. He moved quickly past them, finding the stairs down. Level 2 was denser, the ceilings lower, the lighting dimmer. Still archives, still documents, but older. He saw dates on boxes: 1700s, 1600s, 1500s. Level 3 was different. The stairs emptied into an antechamber with walls of solid steel. Beyond was a corridor lined with vault doors, each marked with a simple number. No descriptions, no indexes, just numbered vaults. The climate control was more aggressive here. He could feel it drying his sinuses with each breath. Vault 12's door was slightly ajar. Lucian pushed it open and found himself in a long, narrow chamber. Lead-lined boxes on shelves, each labelled in Latin. He scanned the labels quickly. Fragmenta Qumrana, Cave 4, Codex Incognitus, Origin Uncertain. Correspondence regarding celestial anomalies, 1633 to 1642. And then he saw it. A glass cylinder on a separate pedestal, about the size of a wine bottle. Inside floated a metallic sphere, suspended in some kind of clear fluid. The sphere was maybe a foot in diameter, its surface covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the LED light. The label beneath read, "Object retrieved near Sinai, July 1948, Custodia Angelica, Papal Decree 347. Lucian approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The sphere seemed to glow faintly from within, pulsing with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Up close, he could see the symbols covering its surface. They weren't engraved. They seemed to be part of the material itself, flowing across the metal like liquid script. Nothing like any alphabet he'd ever seen. He took out his phone, hands shaking, and photographed the sphere from every angle. Then he noticed the leather-bound volume on the shelf beside the cylinder. The cover was blank except for 2 words in gold leaf. Chronicon Externum, Chronicle of the Outsiders. Lucian opened it carefully. The pages were vellum, the ink medieval, but the text had been written in modern Italian, a translation of something older. He read the first passage. In the 4th year of Constantine's reign, lights appeared over Rome for 3 nights. They moved with purpose against the stars. The Bishop of Rome declared them signs of divine favour, but in private correspondence he wrote, "They are the same lights our forefathers saw, the same visitors who came before Christ, before Moses, before the flood. We do not speak of them openly, for the people are not ready to understand that we are not alone in God's creation." Lucian flipped through pages, his mind reeling. Passage after passage described encounters between church figures and beings descending from the sky. References to lights over Byzantium in the 9th century. Strange visitors to monasteries in the Andes in the 1500s. Objects recovered from ancient sites and quietly brought to Rome. And then he found an entry dated 1793. The sphere brought from Egypt contains knowledge forbidden to man. Its makers understood the architecture of life itself. They knew what we are, how we were formed. perhaps even shaped our development. This knowledge must remain sealed, for if the faithful learned that their origins were guided by intelligence not divine, the foundation of Christendom would crumble. Lucian heard footsteps. He closed the volume, grabbed his phone and moved toward the back of the vault. There, another door, barely visible in the shadows. It led down. Level 4. The stairs were narrow, carved from bedrock rather than constructed. Each step showed chisel marks, as if this passage had been hewn by hand centuries ago. The walls were no longer finished stone but raw rock, damp with condensation, as if this level had been excavated from the earth itself rather than built into it. The air changed as he descended, colder, heavier, charged with something he couldn't name, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, thick with potential energy. His phone's flashlight beam bounced off the moisture on the rough walls. The stairs spiraled down, deeper than the blueprints had suggested. 19 meters, Momo's plans had said, 62 feet. But it felt deeper, as if he were descending not just through rock, but through time itself, peeling back layers of history to reach something primordial. At the bottom was a single chamber, just as the blueprint showed. The Sala Indicis. Lucian stepped off the final stair and stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The room was circular, maybe 40 feet across, with a domed ceiling that disappeared into shadow above. The walls were ancient stone, not Roman, older, predating even the Empire. But embedded in those ancient walls was technology that seemed pulled from a science fiction film. Computer servers lined the perimeter, their LED indicators blinking in the darkness like a constellation. Fibre optic cables snaked across the stone floor. Climate control units hummed softly, maintaining precise temperature and humidity. Electrical conduits ran along the ceiling, feeding power to equipment that had no business existing in a medieval vault. But all of that was peripheral. His eyes went immediately to the centre of the room. A large glass case, maybe 10 feet tall and 6 feet wide, stood on a raised platform of polished black stone. Inside, suspended in electromagnetic fields that crackled faintly with blue-white energy, was a sphere. Not like the smaller one upstairs. This was massive, perhaps 6 feet in diameter, large enough that a person could stand inside it. The surface gleamed with a metallic sheen that shifted colours as Lucian moved, bronze to silver to copper to colours he didn't have names for. The sphere wasn't still. It rotated slowly, majestically, in the electromagnetic field, and as it turned, the symbols covering its surface became visible. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, flowing across the metal like water, rearranging themselves in patterns that made Lucian's eyes hurt to follow. The light from the sphere cast strange shadows on the walls, not the hard-edged shadows of ordinary objects, but soft, diffuse glows that seemed to have depth and dimension of their own. Lucian approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the chamber. As he got closer, he realized the sphere was humming, not the mechanical hum of the servers, but something organic, alive. The sound Ricci had described, like breathing, like something that had a heartbeat. The temperature near the sphere was different, warmer. The air shimmered slightly as if reality itself bent around the object, and on the wall behind it, projected from somewhere inside the sphere itself, were images. A star map. But not any stars Lucian recognized from Earth's night sky. The constellations were wrong, the patterns unfamiliar. Either this map showed the cosmos from a different vantage point, somewhere else in the galaxy perhaps, or it depicted the sky as it had appeared thousands of years ago, before the slow dance of stellar drift had changed the heavens. Beside the star map was another diagram, and Lucian's scientific training allowed him to recognize it immediately. A double helix. DNA. But not quite human DNA. The structure was similar, the same basic architecture of nucleotides and base pairs. But there were additional elements, extra strands, sequences that shouldn't exist in terrestrial genetics. It looked like a blueprint, or a recipe, instructions for creating something. and at the bottom of the projection, in symbols that somehow translated themselves in his mind, not in words, but in pure meaning, in concepts that bypassed language entirely, was a message. They came before Adam, before the first human, before the garden, before the story that billions of people believed explained where humanity began. Lucian stood transfixed, his mind struggling to process the implications. This wasn't evidence of ancient visitors. This was evidence of intervention, of design, of humanity being created, or at least guided, modified, engineered, by something that came from the stars. His hand reached out almost of its own volition toward the glass case. The surface was cold, vibrating faintly from the electromagnetic fields within. "Mr. Ferraro," the voice echoed through the chamber, cold and precise. Lucian spun around. One was elderly, with silver hair and cold eyes. The other was younger, carrying a tablet computer. "Mr. Ferraro," the older man said in accented English, "you've come quite far." Lucian recognised him from photographs. Monsignor Alfredo Rizzi, from the Secretariat of State. "What is this?" Lucian asked. "Protection," Rizzi said simply. "Archives are sealed for the safety of the faithful. Some truths cause more destruction than ignorance. You're hiding evidence that humanity was visited by extraterrestrial intelligence." "We're preserving social order," Rizzi corrected. "Look at this object. Truly look at it. What do you see?" Lucian looked back at the sphere. The symbols were rearranging faster now, as if responding to his presence. "I see proof," he said. "You see questions without answers," Rizzi replied. "Who made this? Why did they come? What did they do to us? And most importantly, where are they now? We've had these objects for centuries, Mr. Ferraro. We've studied them with the best scientific minds the Church could provide, and we still don't know. Then tell the world. Let everyone study them. And watch civilization tear itself apart." Rizzi shook his head. "The artifact suggests human origins may have been engineered, that we were designed, or at minimum influenced by non-human intelligence. How do you think that knowledge would affect the 6 billion people who believe they were created in the image of God, or the billions more who have different but equally fundamental origin stories? People have a right to the truth. People have a right to stability," Rizzi countered, "to meaning, to hope. This," he gestured at the sphere, "offers only chaos, questions that undermine every foundation we've built civilization upon. So you'll keep it buried forever, until humanity is ready, if that day ever comes." Rizzi nodded to his companion, who tapped something on the tablet. The lights in the chamber brightened. Lucian could see security cameras in every corner. "You've been recorded since you entered Level 3, Rizzi said. "We could charge you with breaking and entering a sovereign nation, but instead, I'm going to offer you a choice. Leave now, forget what you've seen, and continue your life. Your research privileges will be restored, your reputation intact. And if I refuse, then you'll disappear into the Vatican's justice system, and no one will find you until we decide to release you. The Holy See has its own laws, its own courts. You have no rights here except those we grant you." Lucian looked back at the sphere one last time. The star map was still visible on the wall behind it. He thought about everything he'd learned. The object from Sinai, the chronicle of the outsiders, the implications that shook the foundations of human history. And he realized Rizzi was right about one thing. He didn't have answers, only more questions. "I'll leave," Lucian said quietly. "But this won't stay buried forever." "Perhaps not," Rizzi agreed, "but not today. Not by you." They escorted him up through the levels, through the corridors, and out into the Roman afternoon. Tourists were streaming towards St. Peter's Basilica, taking selfies, buying souvenirs, completely unaware of what lay beneath their feet. Acet 7. The final revelation. Lucian tried to publish his findings. He contacted journalists at major newspapers, the New York Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Corriere della Sera. He reached out to academics he'd known for years, people he'd published with, collaborated with, trusted. He shared his photographs, his recordings from the deathbed confession. is documentation of the blueprints and the historical trail leading to Level 4. No one would touch it. At first, they seemed interested. A journalist from the Washington Post spent 2 hours on the phone with him, asking detailed questions, requesting follow-up evidence, then radio silence. When Lucian finally reached him again, the journalist said simply, "The story doesn't check out. Our Vatican sources say the documents you're referencing are forgeries. I'm sorry." An editor at The Guardian was more direct. "Look, Lucian, I believe you believe this, but we'd need more than photographs and second-hand accounts. We'd need the actual artifacts, independent verification, multiple sources, and frankly, even if it's all true, I'm not sure publishing it would serve the public interest. This would cause global chaos." A history professor at Oxford, someone Lucian had known since graduate school, was blunter still. "You need help, mate. Professional help. This conspiracy theory thinking, it's not healthy. Take a break. See someone. Get your head sorted." The Vatican's influence was subtle but comprehensive. Publications that showed initial interest suddenly lost interest. Editors who wanted the story were transferred or replaced. One journalist who pushed too hard, a freelancer in Rome who'd started asking questions at the Vatican press office, found her credentials revoked for ethical violations that were never specified. Her work visa was questioned. She left Italy 2 weeks later. Lucian realised the pattern. They weren't killing the story through force. They were killing it through erosion, through institutional pressure, through the application of influence accumulated over 2,000 years of existence. How do you fight an institution that's outlasted empires? 2 weeks after his expulsion from the archives, on a Wednesday evening as Rome settled into its golden hour light, Lucian returned to his apartment to find an envelope on his doormat. No postage, no courier stamp. Just a crisp white envelope that had been hand-delivered by someone who could access his building without being buzzed in. Inside was a single note, handwritten in elegant cursive script. "Truth is a burden, Mr. Ferraro. Some carry it for a lifetime, others are crushed beneath its weight. Leave it where it belongs, in the dark, where it can harm no one." Beneath the note was a photograph. It showed him standing in Level 4, illuminated by the blue-white glow of the sphere, looking up at the star map on the wall. The image was crisp, high resolution, taken by one of the security cameras Rizzi had shown him. The message was clear. "We were watching. We are always watching. We have evidence of your trespass. We can use it whenever we choose." But at the bottom of the envelope, tucked beneath the photograph, Lucian found something else. Something they hadn't meant to send. Or perhaps something they had meant to send, though he couldn't fathom why. A small shard of metal, no larger than his thumbnail. Irregular in shape, as if it had been broken off a larger piece. It had the same strange texture as the sphere, smooth but somehow organic, with that peculiar sheen that shifted colours as it caught the light. The same flowing symbols covered its surface, impossibly small, visible only when he held it up to his desk lamp and squinted. Lucian turned it over in his fingers, his heart racing. Was this a threat? A warning? Or something else? A test, perhaps? Or an admission that the truth couldn't be contained forever? That it leaked out in fragments and whispers despite their best efforts? He set it on his desk and watched it in the dimming evening light. And then it began to glow. Faint at first. Just a hint of luminescence from deep within the metal itself. But as the apartment darkened and night settled over Rome, the glow intensified, a soft blue-white pulse that matched the rhythm he'd seen in the sphere. Like a heartbeat, like something alive. Lucian picked it up again. The metal was warm now, generating its own heat. The symbols seemed to move, flowing across its surface like liquid mercury, rearranging themselves into new configurations. He held it close, studying the patterns, and as he watched, something impossible happened. The symbols began to make sense. Not in words. He couldn't have translated them into Italian or English or any human language. But in concepts, in pure meaning that bypassed language entirely, the patterns conveyed information directly into his mind. Coordinates, Not on Earth, but in space. A location among the stars, 42 light-years distant in the direction of the constellation Cancer. A time period, 200,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia. And something else. A purpose. A reason. They had come because Earth was one of thousands. Because intelligence was rare but not unique. Because they had seeded life across this arm of the galaxy. Modifying, guiding, watching. Not gods, not demons, just gardeners, cultivating intelligence wherever they found promising raw material. And they were still watching. Lucian set the shard down, his hands shaking. The glow faded as soon as he released it, dimming back to inert metal. He sat in the darkness of his apartment for a long time, the shard on his desk pulsing softly, rhythmically, like a beacon or a message or a promise. Outside his window, Rome glowed in the night. Millions of people living their lives in the eternal city, walking streets that had been walked for 3,000 years, praying in churches built on pagan temples, believing they understood where they came from, why they were here, what their place in the cosmos meant. And beneath the Vatican, in chambers sealed from the world, an object pulsed with light that had travelled across stars, carrying a truth that had been hidden for millennia. Lucian thought about Rizzi's words, about his grandmother's faith, about the journalist who'd fled Italy, about the fabric of civilization built on beliefs that might be beautiful lies. Was truth always good? Was knowledge always liberating? Or were some truths too dangerous to speak aloud? He didn't know, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world's origin story was far stranger than anyone imagined. We weren't alone in the universe. We never had been. And somewhere, 42 light-years away, or perhaps much closer, they were still out there. The gardeners who'd shaped us, the visitors who'd come before Adam, the intelligence that had guided human evolution and then stepped back, watching to see what we'd become. Lucian picked up the shard again. In the dim light of his apartment, the symbols rearranged themselves one more time, forming a pattern he recognised instinctively, even though he'd never seen it before. A question. Are you ready? He didn't know how to answer. How could anyone answer that? Was humanity ready to learn its true origins? Ready to understand that we were designed, cultivated, engineered for purposes we could barely comprehend? The shard pulsed once more in his hand, warm and alive and waiting. Not yet, Lucian thought, but soon. The truth was waiting. It had waited 10,000 years, buried beneath temples and sealed in vaults, hidden in chromosomes and encoded in artifacts scattered across the world. It could wait a little longer, but not forever, because fragments had a way of accumulating. Whispers had a way of growing louder, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of finding the light. Lucian placed the shard in his desk drawer, in a small wooden box that had belonged to his grandmother. The irony wasn't lost on him, hiding evidence that would destroy her faith inside a keepsake from her life of devotion. He turned off his desk lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to the sounds of Rome at night, scooters buzzing past, voices drifting up from the street, somewhere, church bells tolling the hour. And beneath all of it, if he listened very carefully, he could still hear the faint hum of that shard in its wooden box, pulsing with its ancient rhythm, like breathing, like something waiting to wake up, like a truth that refused to stay buried. Lucian closed his eyes and thought about the future, about a day when that drawer would be opened, when that shard would be studied by scientists not bound by Vatican secrecy, when its message would be decoded and shared and understood by all of humanity. That day would come, maybe not in his lifetime, maybe not in his daughter's lifetime, but someday. Because truth, he'd learned, was patient, and the visitors who'd come before Adam, they were patient too, watching from 42 light-years away, or perhaps much closer, waiting to see if their garden would finally bloom into something worth revealing themselves to, waiting to see if humanity was ready to learn that we weren't created in God's image, we were created in theirs.